Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Welcome in our next committee meeting. I have to say this is a little bit a strange room. I'm looking for the members. Yes, I see. But yeah, that's the way it is. I would like to start with the adoption of the agenda. If there are no comments, the agenda can be adopted as announced. We will have in this room interpretation in 16 languages, and as always, the meeting is web streamed. And you can find all the necessary documents. They are made available in an electronic way. I would like to make the following announcements also with regard to the coordinators' meeting of this morning. The following experts will be invited for the next EMIS hearing on the 16th of June. That will be Mr. Dorothee Saar from the Deutsche Umwelthilfe, Mr. Pascu Sabido and Mr. Oliver Hoedeman of the Corporate Europe Observatory, Professor Kai Borgeest, Aschaffenburg University of Applied Science, and Mr. Daniel Lange, the CEO of Faster IT. As usual, the written questions will be sent to the guests and will be distributed to the members ahead of the hearing. I can inform the members that with regard to the discussion we had this morning, I will take all the necessary measures on behalf of our committee to make sure that all witnesses and all experts that are included in our planning accept to take part in our hearings. I recently, just half an hour ago, took contact with the IMCO chair to try and get a better coordination between the respective calendars as regards to the ongoing work on the EU type approval framework. Further written questions will be sent to the car manufacturers and automotive suppliers. So another questionnaire is being drafted. We're in the course of drafting it together with the coordinators and the rapporteurs. An additional request for information will be sent to the GRC as a follow-up of their hearing, as we consider the information as we have received so far not to be sufficient. And from now on, all AMI's official correspondence will be posted on the website. Does anybody have any comments? That is not the case. Then the minutes of the AMIS meeting of the 19th of April are available on the online meeting, and if there are no comments, they will be considered as being approved. If there are no comments, I think we can proceed to the first part of the hearing of today. And I would very warmly like to welcome Mr. Richard Smokers, Principal Advisor, and Mr. Rob Keulenaren, Senior Consultant of the Sustainable Transport and Logistics Area of the Netherlands Organisation for Applied Scientific Research, better known as TNO, well, rather well known as TNO, I have to say. As always, dear colleagues, we have a time constraint of 1 hour and 15 minutes for this first half. And I gladly would like to give the floor to Mr. Richard Smoking to give an introduction of 10 minutes, and then we immediately proceed to our hearing. Mr. Smokers.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the committee for inviting us. We're very happy to be here. I'll talk you through a presentation very briefly. I will not explain everything that's on the slides, but you can read the details, but just to set the stage for further discussions. What I'd like to present today is our results on measurements of NOx, nitrogen oxide emissions of diesel cars over the last years, both in the lab and on the road. TNO was already introduced. Oh, sorry. We're the Netherlands Organisation for Applied Scientific Research, an independent research organisation in the Netherlands with 3,000 employees working in very different fields. But one of them is the Sustainable Transport and Logistics Department, where we perform measurements of vehicle emissions in order to assess the environmental impacts of transport. In summary, this is going too fast, like this. First of all, a summary. If you look at what we have measured over the last 5 years on Euro 5 and Euro 6 cars, we've tested both passenger cars and vans. We see that under real-world conditions, both in the lab on real-world test cycles as well as on the road, the NOx emissions of diesel cars are very much higher than the values measured on the type approval tests. For Euro 5, that's about a factor of 3 to 4 higher than the type approval values. For Euro 6, it's a factor of 2 to 6. And for Euro 5 vans, we see a factor of 3.5 higher emissions on the road than the type approval limits for smaller vans class 1 and 2, and a factor of 6 for the larger vans class 3. And this picture is consistent over the wide spectrum of vehicles that we have tested of different brands and different models. Going to this one is very sensitive. Apologies for that. The test program is executed for our Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. We've been doing this over the last 30 years in a sequence of projects where we look at passenger cars, vans, trucks and buses, measure pollutant emissions and CO2. The main goal of the work is not to enforce emission legislation or to identify fraud or defeat devices. The main goal of our work is actually to get insight in the real-world emissions of road vehicles as input for various say studies, assessments, etc. for Dutch air quality policy. So the focus is really on understanding what vehicles emit under real-world conditions on the road for air quality purposes. Also, the work provides insight in the performance of new technologies, and that's relevant, for instance, for stimulation measures. And also the work provides input for the Dutch contribution to work done here in Brussels on a new regulation. We operate state-of-the-art test methods. Just for the fun of it, I also included a picture of 1970 when we started this type of things. Of course, nowadays it's much more modern. Since 2011, we work on the roller bench of Horribahn in Germany. That's a state-of-the-art facility. We operate our own on-the-road measurements using PEMS, and also we have developed in 2014 a simplified measurement method to test vehicles on the road called SEMS. And all these different methods are used to make an inventory of vehicle emissions. Basically what has happened over time is that there has been sort of a co-evolution of vehicle technology and measurement methods where vehicles become more complex and the measurement method also becomes more advanced and giving better insight in the real-world vehicle emissions. And what needs to be mentioned here is that measuring on the road is actually only possible since 2011 when PEMS equipment became available. Before that time we gained insight in the real-world emissions of vehicles by testing them on the roller bench, but not on the NEDC, but on driving cycles that were derived from real-world driving. If you look at the vehicle side, vehicles have become much more complex, from simple mechanically controlled engines on the diesel side to vehicles with complex electronic controls, closed diesel particulate filters, and either combinations of EGR, LNT and SCR to tackle the NOx emissions. In the light of the discussion of this committee, it's not all bad news on diesel vehicles and emission legislation. The PM standards for particulate matter have actually led to widespread adoption of diesel particulate filters, which have made diesel vehicles very clean when it comes to PM emissions. They're actually below the limit, which is already very low, and comparable with the emissions of petrol vehicles since Euro 5. But for nitrogen oxides, for NOx, the picture is different. What we've seen on Euro 5 vehicles since 2010 is that their NOx emissions are very sensitive to deviations from the type approval test conditions. Basically, almost all of the vehicles that we tested showed elevated NOx emissions under real-world test conditions, and not elevated by percents, but elevated by factors. A factor of 3, 4, 3 to 6, depending on the vehicles you're looking at. And this difference cannot be explained by differences in the driving dynamics in different cycles or the lab versus the road. Also, we see some typical behavior showing the sensitivity of NOx emissions to deviations from the type approval test conditions. If you use another cycle on the roller bench but with all the other conditions the same, emissions go up by factors. And also what we've seen on a lot of vehicles, where you would expect that a vehicle that starts with a warm engine is actually cleaner than one that starts with a cold engine, where the engine and the after treatment still needs to heat up. We've seen since Euro 5 actually the reverse, it's the other way around, that a vehicle with a warm engine is less clean than a vehicle that is tested with a cold start. That also made that measurements in the lab on the roller bench for us became no longer useful for determining the real-world emission performance of vehicles. These observations have also been confirmed by measurements by other labs, including EMPA in Switzerland and JRC. In Euro 6, what we see is a mixed picture in the lab. Some vehicles are clean on all of the cycles where you test them. Some are sensitive to different driving cycles. But on the road, they show a very consistent behavior of emissions being a factor 2 to 6 above the type approval limit. And that's seen with only one exception. We've seen one vehicle that also has quite low NOx emissions, not below the limit, but at least of the same order of magnitude. But basically, it's consistent throughout the whole series of vehicles that we've tested. Then looking at what that means for the development of real-world NOx emissions of diesel vehicles, this picture shows the emission limits. The black bars are for diesel, the grey for petrol. What you see is that for diesel vehicles, the limit has been higher than for petrol since Euro 2. So they were already given some more room to emit NOx. If you then look at the green bar in the next graph, that's the emissions on the road of petrol vehicles, which are consistently below the limits for all of the Euro classes, roughly a factor of 2 or more. And if you then look at the blue bar in the graph, that's the emissions, the NOx emissions of diesel cars. They were below the limits for Euro 1 and Euro 2, but they have been consistently above the limits for Euro 3 up to Euro 6. And basically, if you look at Euro 1 to Euro 5, the limit has gone down by a factor of 5, while the emissions have stayed roughly constant. They've gone down a little bit, but not significantly. For Euro 6, we see some improvement, but the picture is still evolving. We're still testing a lot of cars at the moment. But basically, what this shows is that emissions are significantly above the type approval limit when vehicles are tested on the roads. Then, of course, the question is, what's the origin of all of this? We've been wondering that over the last years also. Basically, the picture that for us emerges from what we see from the vehicles is that basically what happens is that manufacturers optimize the hardware and software of their vehicles towards the test conditions of the type approval test procedure. Basically, the type approval test procedure measures the car under very specific conditions with respect to load, temperature, duration of the test. And this allows an optimization of the hardware and software to perform well under those under conditions close to those type approval conditions, but less well under conditions that deviate from that. Obviously, the feed devices could also be an origin of the observed emission behavior, but in the way we test cars, we cannot claim that we have seen the feed devices. And also the legislation, of course, is quite unclear on what is a defeat device. But in any case, both possible origins would lead to the same emission behavior on the road, high emissions compared to the type approval values. And that's illustrated in this graph. I hope you can see it. Basically, horizontally, the horizontal axis shows the width of, say, normal driving conditions, the whole bandwidth of conditions that can be seen on the road. And type approval test conditions are only covering a very small part of that. If a vehicle would have a defeat device, a hard switch, it would operate well on the type approval test and close to it and have very much higher emissions under all other conditions. What we see happening from our test is more like the green and the blue line, emissions that are lower for conditions that are close to the type approval conditions and going up when conditions become more severe, more higher loads, etc., compared to these type approval test conditions, but no discrete switching behavior. Basically what this comes down to is that the emission behavior of vehicles is not robust to small variations in the test conditions within the boundaries of normal driving. And the funny thing is that this robustness of these emissions, which you would expect and which is necessary to make sure that the legislation leads to low emissions in real world driving, this robustness is neither tested nor required by the current regulation. Another thing that's not required is actually for manufacturers to be responsible for their cars in use. Their responsibility for the emission performance is limited to cars as they leave the factory, and is also tested under these very specific conditions, not only for type approval, also for conformity of production and durability requirements. And that means that when we confront manufacturers with our emission results, they can basically always discard them as saying they're not measured according to the official EU test procedure. Yes, but these are the emissions that we measure on the road, and these are the emissions that are relevant for local air quality. So effectiveness of emission legislation would require also looking at vehicles after they left the factory. Our main worry over the last years has been what the consequence of all of this is, and that's not who is doing something wrong. The consequence of these high emissions is that cities are failing to meet the EU air quality standards for NO2 in time. And there's basically two things happening. These high emissions of modern diesel cars and NOx emissions, on the one hand, lead to high concentrations of NO2 in cities, partly because of the high emissions and partly because of the increased share of diesels in the fleet. But they also reduce the effectiveness of measures that cities can take to reduce the NO2 concentrations. Fleet renewal schemes, scrappage schemes, environmental zoning do less if new vehicles are not significantly cleaner than old vehicles. So it basically causes the problem to be bigger and the solutions to be less effective. And that means that cities have to implement a large number of additional, often very complex, costly, other air quality measures in order to meet the standards in time. And I think that point is not sufficiently highlighted in many of the discussions in the last half year. Then, of course, the question is what has TNO done with all these results? Together with the Ministry of Environment in the Netherlands, we have asked for attention for these measurement results. For many years, actually already before 2010, we've done that with the emission behavior that we saw with Euro 4 vehicles. We've done that within the Netherlands by showing the results to a wide range of stakeholders. We've done that here in Brussels by submitting the results to various working groups working on the EU type approval legislation. We've published reports, scientific papers, shared the results also with JRC and with Hermes. That's a working group of other TNO-like organizations working on emission factors. Things have been shared with our Parliament. We've also organized a couple of large stakeholder meetings last year and the year before, asking attention for this, and of course also presented things in the press. Last slide. Last question, of course, is are the developments underway with respect to improving the regulation going to help? From our experience, we think that the WLTP as a new test cycle is not going to do a lot to improve real-world emission performance because, after all, it's still a lab test with very specific test conditions. And even though the engine load that is tested is a bit broader than on the NEDC, you can still optimize towards those conditions. We do think that the RDE, the real driving emissions, are a good start for effective legislation. 2 points to be made. A separate evaluation of emissions under urban traffic conditions we think is essential. And also what got lost in the discussion a bit, the net stringency of the regulation is not just determined by the conformity factor, but by the combination of the conformity factor, the width of the test regime, which trips are called normal driving, and the method that's used to evaluate the test results to a number to which the conformity factor is applied. So attention to the details in the last phases of determining this new regulation is important. That's what I wanted to say in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a few minutes more, but no problem. Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. We go for the first round, and we start with the rapporteurs. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Zalba, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you to Mr. Smokers. Clearly, as we've seen from the graphs, there have been improvements from Euro 1 up until Euro 6. The speaker interrupts.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Smokers. Thanks to your presentation, we've seen there have been consistent improvements on emissions from Euro 1 up to Euro 6. Nonetheless, I understand that you're aware that the Commission wants to take stock of the defects in the existing system and made a start in 2009 to real driving emissions tests. this was my understanding, should make Europe the first region in the world that would have official tests based on real driving conditions. I think they've put that in mind. And then, in relation to your written answers, you've said that there may be as much as 10 to 20 times more NOx than allowed by type approval standards. When you're in high speed, when you talk about high speed, what do you mean there? And I'd also be glad to know about your reply on page 7 of your replies, when you say that current legislation isn't clear regarding the definition of defeat devices. Now, at an earlier hearing, another speaker said that these defeat devices cannot be detected. So here's my question to you. What can be done to solve that problem? If there's no clear definition and you can't actually detect these defeat devices, it seems to me that we have a problem. What solution would you offer for that? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. Basically, I've noted 2 questions. One is about high emissions at high speeds. With the current vehicles, we indeed see very high levels of NOx emissions when vehicles are driven at high speeds on the highway, especially at speeds above 130 kilometers per hour. We test our vehicles also on the highway in Germany, where we drive them up to 150 kilometers per hour. And that's where you see emissions that indeed sometimes are a factor of 20 higher than the type approval limit. That's not to say that emissions could not be lower. That's what we measure on the existing vehicles. Also, on the other side of the spectrum, high emissions will also be seen, high emissions per kilometer driven in urban driving with a lot of stop and go, because as you can imagine, if a vehicle stands still but the engine is running, you have infinite emissions per kilometer. So also on the other side of the spectrum, high emissions are seen in city traffic where vehicles are standing still quite a lot. Then you had a question about, say, the clarity of the emission legislation with respect to defeat devices. I don't want to go into, say, the legal aspects of how to define that. That's difficult. Basically, for us as laymen, the legislation said it's not allowed to use defeat devices, but it doesn't really specify what it is and how you should test it. And especially, it does not specify a procedure to test the presence of defeat devices, and that makes it difficult for anyone who would like to research this and at some point claim that a manufacturer is using defeat devices to actually build up legal proof of that. And I think that has hindered various parties in making a relation between these high real-world emissions and the defeat devices. Also, if it's not clearly defined what they are, then you don't know how much research it's going to take to prove it. And in our test program, that's important to note, the test program we do for the Ministry of Environment of the Netherlands, the focus is on getting insight in the real-world emissions of vehicles, and that means that you choose not to spend too much time in researching individual vehicle models looking for technical origins of what you see. We need a broad database of a lot of measurements of a lot of vehicles to get good emission factors for air quality policy. So basically that also means that if you have difficulty understanding how to test a defeat device, you're not going to test it if your focus is on something else.
Mr. Zalba? Very briefly, half a minute.
Yeah, very briefly. Going back to my first comment, so can we agree and can we somehow be proud that Europe is going to be the first in the world to use official real driving emission testing? Can we confirm so? Thank you.
Yes, I think we're the first in the world, but I don't know whether that's the most relevant thing. The relevant thing is that we do believe that the RDE approach, testing vehicles on the road as part of the type approval, is the solution to solve this problem, provided it's implemented in an effective way.
Thank you very much. Mr. Geerbrande.
Ja, dank u wel, mevrouw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few technical questions to try and get rid of some misunderstandings, and then we'll get a bit more political subsequently. Now, if I've read your written answers properly, I understand that the combination of existing technologies should allow cars to meet the existing NOx standards per kilometre emission?
On the type approval test, we do see basically all vehicles meet the limits. And that means that if the equipment that's mounted on the vehicle works as it's intended to be, you reach those emission levels.
Dank u. De tweede vraag is...
Thank you. My second question is also based on your written replies. Is it correct that you don't actually see any reason for doing away with LNT and SCR technologies to avoid possible damage to engines?
We see no technical reasons for SCR and LNT to be switched off or switched down. The systems operate relatively independent from the engine, so the amount of LNT or SCR that you use is not affecting, say, the technical performance of the engine.
Dank u wel.
Thank you. A third technical point. Much has been said to the effect that focusing on CO2 means that you end up with higher NOx emissions. On the basis of your replies, I note that that effect is actually marginal. Is that right?
There is a trade-off between fuel efficiency and NOx at the engine level. So looking at engine-out emissions, NOx will go up if you make the engine more efficient. But essentially the fact that nowadays emission after treatment technology is applied decouples that relation. That means that out of the exhaust there's no longer a direct correlation between fuel efficiency and NOx. And also that's the other part of the coin. If there would still be a penalty, a CO2 or fuel efficiency penalty from applying NOx after treatment devices, that can be compensated by applying a little bit more CO2 reducing technologies, of which the total potential, which has been assessed as part of, say, the assessments for the European CO2 legislation, is far larger than what is required to meet 130 grams per kilometer standard.
Dit haalt wel een aantal...
Now, that relates to a number of points that were made earlier on in our committee. Now I'll come on to a more political point. From the documents, I see that as early as 2010, TNO was writing about an increasing difference between NOx emissions in real road conditions and on the roller bench. Now, I see that a new strategy is being used, you mentioned in your new report. So can I ask you what you did with the information? Has there been pressure on political spheres to get action taken about this? And in the Dutch domestic context as well as you might.
Of course, we do the work for the Dutch Ministry of Environment, so that means that all the results have been shared with the Ministry. Together with the Ministry, the results have also been shared with a lot of other stakeholders, so we've raised attention for the issue in various gremia. On the question, have we done enough? That's always difficult to say. In hindsight, I think the Netherlands has been one of the most active countries in raising attention for this point. The Dutch delegation to all the working groups on type approval regulation in Brussels has submitted our information several times in various working group meetings to discuss what we saw. And actually, we think that the test results that we provided were at the basis of the developments of the RDE legislation. So in that sense, it also has had effect. The only thing is that it only has effect on vehicles that are still to be built and not yet on the vehicles that are on the road right now.
Thank you. Then my final question, based on your final slides on air quality in cities, you said that due to the much higher emissions by cars on the road, we're never going to meet the air quality standards in our European cities. You have been mentioning that in your reports for quite some years. Do you have the feeling that political level, especially at European level, has done too little to tackle that problem and was focusing too much on the technical standards for cars and not on the air quality in cities?
Difficult question. That's clear. I think for all of the insiders in, say, air quality policy, this fact has been known for some time, and of course, basically it doesn't matter too much what we think about it. Basically what we see that the fact has been accepted as a fact, as a given for some time, rather than spurring action to solve it already on the in the present time frame rather than in the future. Where exactly the origin of that is, that's difficult to judge for us. We've done our best in raising the issue, but indeed it has not received sufficient attention.
Thank you very much. No doubt we come back to that. Mr. Karens, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smokers, I have been listening to what you've been saying just now. I've read through the materials. I've looked at the report, your last one, I guess, from this year. Summing up, could you say in somewhat straightforward and plain language, if we want to attain our emissions goals, as in the legislation, Euro 6 now, we have the CO2 goals, we have the NO2, the NOx goals. Do we have to move away from diesel technologies to attain these goals? Is diesel just, do we have to basically write it off, or can diesel engines do the job?
We don't think you have to move away from diesel engines to reconcile both targets. First of all, that's also what we write in the answers to the technical questions. We think that with the technologies available, if you combine EGR with LNT and or SCR in the right way and make it functional under a wide range of operating conditions, then vehicles on the road can have diesel vehicles on the road can have NOx emission levels that are at least of the order of the 80 milligrams per kilometer limit for diesel vehicles. So with the current technology, it's possible to reach that. And that means that diesel vehicles can still be on the road and can still contribute to cleaning up the air if they indeed reach that performance under real-world conditions.
Okay, many millions of people just breathe a sigh of relief, the people who are actually constructing the vehicles with the diesel engines. Now, if the technology is fine and the technologies exist, what do we have to change to make sure that the technology is actually being used correctly?
Basically what needs to change is that the requirements should be such that the full functioning of all the systems that are applied is also required on the road under real-world conditions. That's what RDE is about. So in principle, RDE is a good solution for that, provided that all the specifications of, say, the test conditions that are accepted as valid for RDE, etc., have a sufficiently wide coverage of real-world conditions. What do you call normal driving, and to what extent is that included in the procedures for RDE? But the principle of testing on the road has proven itself. At the moment when we test trucks on the road, we actually see that Euro 6 trucks for NOx are cleaner than Euro 5 vans, and even cleaner than some passenger cars. The emissions are at the same level, and that's caused by the fact that for heavy-duty vehicles already this test on the road has been included as part of the total type approval procedure.
Then my third question would be, are these technologies, the combination, if properly used, are they cost competitive, say with petrol engines? So to actually install it all and use it, add the fluid, et cetera, is it cost competitive?
Yeah, it depends on the definition of cost competitive. Of course, it's going to make the vehicles more expensive, and you're not earning it back as you would, for instance, with measures that make vehicles more efficient, where you have fuel cost savings. So in principle, adding technology to make vehicles cleaner makes them more expensive. I don't think this is the place to really discuss details of the cost. If these would need to be reassessed ex post, that would require a bigger study. But what you can say is that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem with the cost of these technologies. Basically, Euro 6 has been designed under the assumption that these technologies would be applied full scale, and if applied full scale and produced at large scale, the costs go down. If you don't apply them full scale, then of course costs do not go down as expected. So that's a bit of a chicken and egg issue. To what extent it influences the competitive position of diesel vehicles towards compared to petrol also depends on a lot of other factors that influence the cost of petrol vehicles in the light of the CO2 legislation. So that's a very complex evaluation. Costs go up, but that was accepted as part of the Euro 6 legislation. It was accepted, the cost level, under assumption of full application of these technologies. If they're now not fully applied, the full costs are not borne. So in principle, there's room to improve.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dance, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Smokers, for your presentation. I'm intrigued by the idea that this combination of technology will deliver the results we need. You've talked about LNT and SCR not having an engineering need for it to be switched off. If I could just focus for a moment on exhaust gas recirculation, the EGR technology, specifically on the thermal window that manufacturers are claiming is needed for operations not to harm the engine. I've received information that some car manufacturers, in fact, to be more specific, Daimler is apparently switching off technology below 10 degrees, Peugeot below 5 degrees, Renault and Opel apparently below 17 degrees. The average temperature in Europe is 9 degrees. What is the engineering rationale for this?
Yeah, the only thing that I can tell you is, of course, also for us hearsay. Basically, manufacturers give us the same explanation. To a certain degree, that explanation is technically plausible, but that doesn't mean that it's a problem that's inevitable. So with the current implementation of EGR technology, what they claim is that there is a clogging of the intercooler, there's basically soot depositing in the system, which at some point leads to failures and requirement for more maintenance. That is possibly a consequence of the way in which the technology is currently implemented. If that is, as they say, related to low intake air temperatures, then we think that the problem can be solved. We haven't researched it, that's what I have to say. We did not develop these systems ourselves, but in principle, in and around the engine, there's plenty of heat available. That's one of the main products of an engine. So heating up the intake air to make sure that EGRs do not suffer from low intake air temperature does not seem a tremendously difficult task. So that's why we basically claim that with the current systems it may be a problem, but thereby it is not an inevitable problem.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And given what you were saying earlier about, and indeed what's contained in your written submission of the questions that we've asked regarding hot restarts, you say it's curious in what you found that the higher the temperature, actually the higher the level of emissions, which of course is contradictory to everything we know about the way in which this technology should work. In the US, they include hot restarts in their testing procedures, which is not the case in Europe. Given that you've said that that the EGR technology in particular should work more efficiently at higher temperatures, why is it that we are seeing higher emissions at higher temperatures? Either you're not telling the truth, which I don't believe is the case, or somewhere this technology is being switched off for reasons that have yet to become clear. Is there any other potential reason for that discrepancy?
No, I think it's the latter. Just to be clear, it's not just a matter of temperature. What I describe in our paper is that if you perform an NEDC test, if you do it according to the type approval legislation, it starts with what is called a cold engine. It's not so very cold. It's between 20 and 30 degrees, conditioned for during an overnight soak. If you then start the engine, then in principle the engine and the after treatment still needs to heat up. So what you would expect is that during the first part of the trip on the NEDC, emissions are elevated and then become lower when the systems heat up. If you repeat the same test, but then with an engine that is just driven, so that is hot as its normal engine and coolant temperatures, then actually we see higher emissions with a warm engine than with a cold engine. That's not so much ambient temperature things, that's the starting condition of the engine. And then indeed there's a counterintuitive observation for which we only can... we have to guess what the basic origin is, but it's something that the manufacturers would need to explain. It is in their control strategy. It cannot be otherwise.
And do you think the inclusion of hot restart testing in the European level was something that might eliminate this discrepancy?
That could be an option, yeah.
Meneer de Mesmaker.
Dank u wel.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Smokers, you've reiterated this point at a number of points this afternoon, and we can see in your written answers too that there are three crucial elements that became clear at earlier hearings, actually. Euro 6 NOx standards of 80 milligrams for commercial vehicles can be reached with existing technology in real driving conditions, so we don't need any new technology. And secondly, that needn't undermine CO2 emission work. They can reduce both of them, that's technically possible. In practice, of course, we're still far removed from that. In your reply to question 2, you put your finger on the point that there are insufficient levels of application of these technologies. And so the question arises as to what the main reasons are for that. Is it to do with the cost price? In your reply to question 5, you referred to increased cost for certain diesel vehicles and the low profit margins. Do you think that that's a significant explanation? As the ACC had earlier on said that we're talking about a €400 increase per vehicle for after-treatment systems. Can you confirm that?
Up to us to really talk about the cost of these systems because we have not studied those in detail recently. But what I can confirm, what is, say, reasonable to assume that the relative cost of the system compared to the cost of the car are higher if you want to apply it full scale at a small car with small profit margins also than when you apply it to a large car which you can sell with large profit margins. So the pressure on the price of the car will be higher for smaller cars. That's evident. But exactly what the cost of these systems are is something we did not study recently, so we should not comment on that.
What prospects do you see for accelerating technical modification?
Yeah, in principle, the RDE needs to do the trick. The question is, could the effects that you want to achieve with RDE be achieved faster than they are now, given the way RDE is introduced? Room for, say, changing something to the existing vehicles is difficult, I think, but making sure that as fast as possible the new vehicles are able to meet this is what you should look for. And then, of course, the question is how fast can manufacturers change the design of their vehicles and the software of their vehicles in order to make them perform better under real-world conditions. That's difficult to judge for us, but that's part of the debate, of course.
Wat zegt dat dan volgens u over het ambitie? Wat zegt dat dan volgens u over het ambitie?
So what does that say about the ambition level of these RDE tests?
Yeah, there are two aspects with the level of ambition. One is the timing. So when do you require it to be effective at full scale? So requiring low conformity factor. And the other thing is the height of the conformity factor itself. And underneath, as I said, it's not just about the conformity factor, but also about the figure, the number to which you apply the conformity factor. And those are all aspects where there could be room for, say, increasing the level of ambition. We don't think that it's it's a compromise, so possibly it could be faster and it could be stricter. But if you really want to know for sure, these are things that require more study, which has not been done, basically. This is not just a matter of debate. Here you need a technical analysis and a view on what the car industry really can achieve, an independent view on what the car industry can achieve. We don't have that, probably also do not have that. That's a difficulty.
In uw antwoord op vraag...
In your reply to question 10, you say that there are critical comments on the PEMS. So what other technical possibilities can you see?
We're not questioning the application of PEMS. Basically, PEMS is a good technology, but it has some level of accuracy which you have to take into account in setting a standard based on a PEMS measurement. We think there's room for improvement compared to the present systems, and also, and that's one thing that we do note here, we see in the current development of systems where companies are now developing systems to be sold at larger scale, larger volumes, a tendency also to apply some technical changes that actually go at the expense of the accuracy. So in this case, applying cheaper or less accurate exhaust flow meters, while actually this measurement is part of the a strong determinant of the accuracy of the system. We believe that there's some room for improvement, but it needs to be demanded through the specifications of the system that are in the regulation.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Meisner, please, on behalf of the ALDE.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize it was my turn. Well, let's carry on with the PEMS, because we've been talking about that just now. Now, you've said that there is room for improvement. We'd like to know what that room for improvement currently is. Next, are there alternatives to PEMS? So far, PEMS hasn't been used because people have been saying that the data isn't accurate enough, and we'd like to have data that's as accurate as possible, measured with the best technology possible. So I wonder what you would suggest as improvements or alternatives.
Thanks for your patience. We don't really have suggestions for, say, further improving the PEMS system. There is some room for improvement, but the question is whether it's actually needed to improve it. It also depends on how you apply the measurement and how you apply limits to the measurement. The debate has very much been about conformity factors going to 1 or not. I think the current problem that we see is that emissions in real-world driving are a factor of 3, 4, 5, 6 higher than on the type approval test. If you get these real-world emissions down to a factor of 1.5 times the type approval limit, you already make a great improvement. And in the light of that, the absolute accuracy of PEMS may be less of an issue than when you require 80 milligrams per kilometer under all conditions. So it's also a matter of how you view the value of the PEMS test in relation to the type approval test you're already doing. I think there is room for different interpretation there. One other development, I already mentioned the SEM system that we developed ourselves, which is a simplified measure. What we could also imagine is that you make a sort of multi-stage evaluation of vehicles, where you do a simplified screening with a number of vehicles from a make model on the road over a longer period, because emissions are also influenced by temperature, weather conditions, traffic conditions, etc. So measuring one day doesn't tell you a lot. And if you then see behavior that is, say, outside of the accepted boundaries, you can go either to PEMS or to roller bench measurements to confirm what you see or to research what you see. So sort of a multi-stage approach could be possible. But in any case, PEMS will not be as accurate as measuring in the lab, but the question is whether you want to write the legislation in such a way that you require similar accuracy that can be defined in different ways where it's not a problem that PEMS is not as accurate as the lab.
Ja, vielen Dank für Ihre Antwort.
Thank you very much for that answer. I've got 2 follow-up questions, briefly. We've heard a lot about the conformity factor. The Parliament has said that 1.0 would be ideal, but we've been told that technically speaking that is impossible. You've talked about a 4-fold and a 5-fold is not being very good at all, and 1.5 would be good. What do you think would be a sensible and realistic conformity factor? Next, you've talked about diesel, and you've said that we shouldn't demonize diesel, we should carry on using it in order to reduce CO2. And then cold and hot start motors, were emissions dependent on engine temperatures? I mean, is diesel a motor that is used or should be used more in the north and more in the south because of environmental temperatures? I mean, it's more difficult to start your car in a cold weather, and that affects emissions.
So the last question first. I think yes, even if EGR, LNT, SCR are applied full scale in these vehicles, there will be a temperature dependence in their emission behavior, and that is something that northern and southern countries may have to deal with. But it will not be of the same order of magnitude as what we see now. If emissions go up by a factor of 5, if you move out of the 20 to 30 degrees window, that's another issue. That's not the same as vehicles having more warm-up time in winter in Scandinavia than in southern Europe. So that's the distinction that we need to make. Coming back to your question on conformity factors, basically our point is do not discuss conformity factors as a standalone thing. A conformity factor only has meaning in relation to the number to which you apply it, and this number depends on the evaluation of the RDE test. If you go on the road with a vehicle and PEMS, you measure something, you run the results through a model, a figure comes out, and on that figure you apply the conformity factor. But the stringency of the legislation is at least equally determined by the span of driving conditions that you consider acceptable and normal driving conditions, so what are the measurements that you discard in that process, and by the formulas, the weighing, the smoothing that is applied by the evaluation tool that generates, that calculates based on an emission trace of a measurement, a number to which the conformity factor is applied. Only in the tandem of the two makes sense to discuss this, being very tight about the conformity factor and then losing on the details in the evaluation method doesn't win you anything.
Mrs. Konečná.
Děkuji, paní předsedkyně. Děkuji také kolegům, kteří nám dneska přišli vysvětlit jejich pozici. A já bych se možná na začátku...
Thank you very much for giving us your views today. I want to start with a political question, but I hope you can give me a factual answer. Chrysler has said that all of their vehicles meet European standards, and they've said that despite the fact that the Bild newspaper published its new information about that company, saying that they're using defeat devices. Representatives refuted that report and refused to meet the German transport minister. And the Italian minister has said that the firm should be left in peace. I wonder if you've measured Fiat vehicles as well, and is it true that they're also using defeat devices? Do you think that they meet with the European rules?
Thank you. Again, to start with the last question, to what extent any of the vehicles and manufacturers that we've tested actually use defeat devices, the answer is we don't know because we did not research that. So in the case of Fiat also, we do not know. I can confirm that we did test a Euro 5 Fiat in the spectrum of vehicles that we had in our measurement program over the last years, which also, as almost all of the other vehicles, showed elevated NOx emissions under real-world test conditions. To what extent that is a proof of defeat devices, that's difficult to say. That's basically what we claim. We're not studying that, so we do not make any claims on that. We basically report what we see as real-world driving behavior. Coming back to the first issue, Fiat claiming that vehicles meet the current legislation, I think most of all of the manufacturers are saying that, and that relates to a question where I don't have the answer to, but basically the question is, what exactly is the European legislation saying? Is it saying vehicles only need to comply with the standards on the type approval test, or is it implying explicitly, implicitly, that also under other conditions the limits need to be met? I think that's a legal debate which even we as technical experts have difficulty to understand, but I think that's part of what the debate is about. So it's a good question, but I don't have an answer on that.
It will come up in further meetings. Mrs. Konečná.
Já děkuji přesto za tu odpověď a budu pokračovat.
Thank you very much for that answer. Let me just pick up on where you left off at the end of your answer. In recent years, what we've experienced has led to us trying to prescribe legislation in such a way, well, we've ended up in a huge mess, basically. We've got these limit values which have been set down, which clearly are not being upheld, and you've said that PEMS isn't entirely relevant. The data cannot be precisely measured, and this is why in the legislation we would need to set different conditions. So I wonder whether you're quite of the view that we're able, through our legislation, to set the framework and make sure that what the manufacturers are telling us is actually a true picture, and whether we, in that way, will be able to tackle the problem.
First of all, we share your observation and concern that so far the emission legislation has failed to make sure that real-world emissions are as low as they should be. I think from the translation you were saying that we said that the PEMS method would not be relevant or applicable to improve the situation. That's not what we said. We think that RDE using PEMS is a very good method to check the real-world performance of vehicles, but in the way you set standards on that method, you of course need to take account of, on the one hand, the accuracy of the PEMS system, and on the other hand, the variation in emission results that you see when you go on the road with a car, where the emissions depend on a lot of factors. If you do that right, the use of PEMS in combination with RDE is a fine instrument.
Meneer Eickhout.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Smokers, for your answers until now. I want to go a bit into the point where you say that the legislation is a bit unclear about what is a defeat device, and you reiterated that statement a couple of times now as well. But if you read the legislation, it states very clearly that you should meet the standards under normal conditions, under normal use, and switch-off devices are prohibited. Only it's allowed if the device is necessary to protect the engine from damage or accident and to guarantee the safe operation of the vehicle. Now, I've heard you saying a couple of times now that from your perspective, only for EGR, maybe for very low temperatures, that could be the case, but for others not. So is it not the case that from that moment any switch device is prohibited?
I'm sorry, but I think our answer needs to be that we would like to stay away from legal interpretations of the text. We've had debates on this with a lot of people to try and understand it. We get different answers. We're not lawyers. So for us, it's very difficult to judge how to interpret a sentence as must comply with under normal driving conditions. It's difficult for us. That's also the reason for us to be very careful with claims about defeat devices based on our measurements.
Okay, then I won't bother you with that one further on, although then you also should be a bit reluctant in saying that it is unclear. It's just unclear for you. Yes, that might be a difference. Just then to continue on the communication when you notice some of the results. Already back in 2010 you had the results, but we also know that JRC had very high emissions results in 2010. What has happened between you, TNO, and JRC? I assume you have had meetings.
Yes, thank you for this question. Of course, we've had a lot of meetings with GRC, but not on a bilateral basis. Both GRC and we as TNO, and TNO as part of the Dutch delegation in a lot of expert groups have brought in the information on the high emissions, high real-world emissions in those meetings. And this information has been exchanged and has been made, available for all parties that were involved.
as far as my information goes, there were already meetings in 2010 on this, and that CSC studies were by some of the national institutes were, well, being said that they were not correct. Is that true?
I'm sorry, I can't recall. No, I don't know. I think...
well, but it is true that in 2010 and 11 there were already meetings with this. Could you then, since maybe you can't recall exactly what happened in those meetings, we do have some people who do recall, can you tell why not so much happened after those meetings? I'm talking about legislative consequences. Commission was there present as well. You would expect that these kind of results would invoke immediate action.
I'm sorry, but I don't think it's up to us as TNO to judge. Well, we have a certain role in those groups, and that is bringing well, what we think is independent information on, in this case, real-world emissions, and it's up to others to well, to take consequences.
I think, Mr. Eckhout, it's issues. And the legal issues and the issues, the political questions, will bring them up when we have the hearings.
Yeah, but I know that these people were at those meetings, so that makes them interesting people to ask questions, right? Then maybe just one final question on, back again to the warm temperature, cold temperature. We know that in the United States the results are exactly the other way around, which would be logical, higher emissions with cold temperatures than with warm temperatures. In Europe it's the other way around. How is that possible?
Well, first of all, that information is new to me, so I would have to look at the details of these tests. But well, first of all, it depends on which vehicles. Is it on the Volkswagen vehicles with the defeat device, or also seen on other vehicles? If these other vehicles are equipped with, say, after-treatment technology that is designed and controlled to operate under all conditions, then you would expect normal behavior, as you say, with higher emissions after a cold start and after a warm start. If that doesn't happen, and if the emissions under a warm start are factors higher than under a cold start, it relates to control strategies and systems being either switched off or not fully switched on. And that depends on which vehicle you're looking at, so it's difficult to comment on that. I assume that if that's what you see is seen on these vehicles, then those are vehicles that are designed in a proper way. But difficult to judge.
If it's possible, we can have a written answer to that question if you have the time to look into the details of the information. That might be helpful. Huh? Yeah. No problem. Okay, Mrs. Avey, please.
Sì, grazie mille.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the replies you've provided us with up until now. At this point, I would like to return to the issue of the conformity factor. On the basis of your reply to question number 1, it seems clear that we shouldn't wait for new technologies to be developed to deliver lower NOx levels, given that the existing technologies are already adequate to achieve that purpose if used in the right combinations. Now, to what extent do you think there is an application of the conformity factor in line with legislation 2.1 by 2020? To what extent do you think that that can be justified?
Thank you. If I understand the question correctly, is how we say judge the suitability of the conformity factors as they are chosen now. I think my answer has to relate to my previous answer. The strictness of those factors very much relates to the number, the figure that you apply it to, and especially that part of the regulation, which measurements you consider valid and how you then translate the measurements into a number. That's the part that's still under discussion. So they cannot be seen separate. And the only thing I can say, we've been in these debates for a long time, and even though the current conformity factors were in the press presented as the auto industry winning over the European Union, the figures are of the level that we sort of hoped would be achievable in the political debate. So in that sense, they're not even that bad. But as I said, the numbers themselves are only part of the equation. So my main message is don't just focus on the conformity factor. This is something which you need to see from an integral perspective, looking at the procedure together with the factor, and only then can you judge whether the full legislation is strict enough to do the trick. And in addition to that, I think it would be very wise over the next years to also monitor whether vehicles that meet the RDE requirements over a broader spectrum of real-world driving conditions do as we expect. As now, with current legislation, we see that the current legislation basically has no control over the real-world emissions. With RDE, that should be much better, but it depends on the details of how the regulation is defined. Please do monitor that over the years, gaining experience with that, measuring the real emissions as they come out of vehicles under all kinds of conditions, and comparing that to the RDE performance of the vehicles. And so the number that comes out of that measurement for these vehicles. And then you can actually test whether RDE as defined gives you sufficient control over the real-world emissions in conditions where it matters.
Can I ask you, how do you think that this, taking into account all what you have said, but how do you think that this will ensure that technology neutrality will still be taken into consideration, considering the fact that we basically introduce this conformity factor just for diesel cars, and so just diesel cars will benefit from this measure?
I don't think technology neutrality is at stake here. Basically, RDE is a correction to the existing legislation to make sure it does what it was expected to do when it was designed. The assessments that were made a long time ago on the Euro 5 and Euro 6 standards assumed, the technical assessments that were done for that, assumed that combinations of EGR, LNT, SCR in different combinations would be applied to a level that would be sufficient to control real-world emissions to the desired level. We now see that the way the legislation is implemented does not make that happen. The RDE is a means to correct that, but basically the technical measures required to meet RDE are not different from what was expected as a technical compliance measure when the Euro 6 limit was established. So basically it's only a correction to make sure that what you expected to happen is actually going to happen. And if the Euro 6 standard was accepted by this Parliament, by the European Commission, as feasible, acceptable from many points of view, competitiveness, cost, whatever, then basically you're now staying within the realm of the considerations made then, because you're only making sure that the things are applied that you expected to be applied. So compared to the way in which Euro 6 was designed, RDE does not do anything new. It basically makes sure that you reach what you intended.
Thank you very much. And the last question in the first round is Mr. Falk. Chalk, sorry.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Now, in your introduction to your responses, you said that what has been published in recent years by TNO has revealed major discrepancies between nitrogen oxide and real driving conditions and workshop conditions. Under Euro 6, the nitrogen oxide emissions were 3 to 5 times higher, and this factor has gone up to 10 or 20 times if there is acceleration to high speeds. Now, the text didn't provoke any particular reaction looking into the possibility of fraud or a defeat device. So the first question is, how would we interpret this tolerance shown by yourselves, given the major discrepancy? Secondly, before last September's revelations, given that there was different types of driving, it would appear that people said that environmentalists were wrong and that all this could be explained your answers, however, would suggest it is quite different. The Euro 6 standards have been brought in to limit nitrogen oxide limits, but also there's been a reduction in carbon dioxide at the same time. So your position would appear to have been rather tolerant, given the discrepancies, and rather limitless optimism, and trying to juggle these pollutants, and yet that has changed. So why have you changed your position? Finally, all technology seems to go hand in hand, and you've got these polluting emissions, but it all appears to be a virtuous circle when it comes to technology. Yet, if you cool things down in order to limit nitrogen oxide emissions, you reduce the effectiveness of the engine because of the propulsion capacity, which increases total use of fuel. Technology, therefore, isn't without its contradictions, and I wonder whether you've got any estimates of the possible cost to the consumer of this technology and the ecological viability of these new accessories, given how they would have to be manufactured and maintained. I'd be very keen if you would answer all of those questions. Thank you.
I hope I still recall all the questions. This time to start with the first question. I think what you're saying is it's natural to expect that the emissions will be higher when vehicles need to work harder, when you drive faster, accelerate faster. Engine out, that is definitely true. And also for a vehicle with emission after-treatment systems, you can still imagine that under certain conditions emissions are higher than under other conditions, because under more harsh conditions the after-treatment has more difficulty to reduce the emissions to the required level. The issue is whether the observed, say, differences, the factors that we see, are consistent with differences in driving dynamics on the NEDC test versus the real world. And there the answer is no. Basically, we think that the high emissions that we see in real world are factors higher than what you expect as a natural response of the engine and as after treatment to variations in the load. And another thing that confirms that is that actually when we test vehicles on the road under driving conditions that lead to engine loads that are comparable to the NEDC, we still see higher real-world emissions. So the real-world emissions on the road are not somehow correlating to what you see in the lab. So in terms of our tolerance towards these differences, yes, differences in tens of percents of NOx emissions under different driving conditions, that could be acceptable. Differences in terms of a factor of 3, 4, 5, 6, that's another matter, and that cannot be explained by the sensitivity of the systems to the load. And in addition, once you start using after-treatment systems that have reduction capacities of 70, 80, 19%, you already get a decoupling of the actual emissions out of the exhaust from what comes out of the engine. So that means that if you make the after-treatment work harder when the engine works harder, emissions do not necessarily have to go up in the same way as they go directly out of the engine. So this is not an automatic trade-off. That's one thing. The other question you had was about the balance between CO2 and NOx. There, already I explained that engine out, so purely looking at the engine without its after-treatment, there is a trade-off. If you make it more efficient, it will emit more NOx. But the fact that you put after-treatment after it is able to compensate for that. So as soon as you start using after-treatment systems, you decouple the pollutant emissions from CO2, meaning that you can reach CO2 reduction and pollutant emission reduction at the same time. And of course, that requires technology, that does involve costs, but these costs have been considered acceptable when both legislations were accepted.
Thank you very much. This concludes the first round of questions and answers. I would like to inform you that you all took like an extra minute on your 5 minutes, asking a question before the end of the 5 minutes and then another response. I will not have that tolerance in the second round. It's just not possible, otherwise we will not get... It's a conformity factor. But I will not be that tolerant in the second round. So please, no too long speeches, but very concrete questions. And that also goes for the answers. So in the second round we have 3 minutes per speaker, including the answer. Question and answer, 3 minutes. And I will be less tolerant. I'm so sorry, Mr. Bellet, you're the first under the new regime. floor is yours.
Thanks for the honor, Mr. Chairwoman. Meneer Smokers, heel kort.
Very brief, Mr. Smokers. On conformity factors, the speaker's mic has gone. Oh. Now, the compromise was in line with our expectations. You're encouraging manufacturers to deliver significant reductions, and we'll encourage them to be more ambitious in the future because of the movers first bonus. Does that hold water?
Well, I think the RDE legislation, especially if the details are implemented in the right way, will make sure that manufacturers do more to make sure that emissions on the roads are more in line with the limits. The extent to which the current regulation or the current RDE proposals also stimulate a dynamics in which first movers are rewarded, that's dubious. I think actually there's a bit of a deadlock where first movers prove to the other manufacturers that they could have done better. So there may even be a situation, a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, where first movers are not rewarded. While actually, indeed, you would want to, in addition to the RDE, it would be nice if you had a system where first movers would be rewarded, because that helps. Anything that's available to solve the issue sooner than required is good for cities.
Ja, dat is heel interessant. Nog één vraag over...
Very interesting. And then a further question regarding PEMS. Indeed, there is a great degree of unreliability. And then you refer to SEMS, the smart emissions measuring systems that you've developed. I'm slightly surprised that there have been so few questions about them. Could you say a bit more? Is SEMS also the second generation of PEMS?
Well, first coming to the first part of your question, I'm not saying that PEMS is highly inaccurate. That's sort of what you seem to suggest. The accuracy of PEMS by definition, because it's a more compact system, is less than the big measurement systems that you have in the lab. But it's not necessarily a problem, and there is room for improvement. Concerning the SEMS system, I don't think this is the place to really make advertisement for our system. The SEMS is a simplified system that also uses signals from the car, and because of that reason, it has even slightly lower accuracy than PEMS. Theoretically, while in practice we see very good correspondence of what we measure in the lab and with PEMS and with SEMS. But at least it could be a very good screening device. Also in terms of, say, independent challenging of RDE results, measuring cars for a whole year on the road, getting indications of what to really do as a first indication of, okay, is this a car that performs the way it's intended? But as I said, this is not a place to advertise for our own developments.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Rivaud-Dallon-Bonnefroy.
Merci.
Thank you. In your response to question 8, you say that anti-CO2 and NOx systems can be developed without causing deficiencies in the motor. And you also, and this is in response to question 1, and this is something we've heard various times during hearings, say that the presence of or the coupling of 2 or 3 anti-pollution technologies involving NOx can be within emission standards. Now, do you think it's obligatory to have 2 anti-NOx systems on light-duty vehicles, or to be able to allow the engine to operate correctly?
It's a good question. I think the answer is no. First of all, you would like the legislation to be as technology neutral as possible, so basically define the legislation in what you expect as performance rather than as requirements on the technology. And second part of the answer is that the performance of these systems is partly determined by the technologies that you apply and whether they are dimensioned in the right way, big enough to reach the required levels of reduction, but also by the software that controls them. And it seems like that's part of the problem. So even if you would require vehicles to have 2 systems, then still the question is whether they're operated in a way that reaches the desired result. And then it's better to actually put requirements on the performance of the car, on what comes out of the car in terms of emissions, rather than on what you screw on it as technology.
Another question. In your response to question 1, again, you talk about the possibility of clogging up of the cooling system, but there's nothing to justify this anti-pollution. But you say you've not been able to just reproduce that? Is that something, therefore, that hasn't been possible? And does it mean that the anti-pollution measures are likely, therefore, to damage the motor? This is the clogging up with lacquer of the intercooler.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a repetition of an answer that I already gave. The current implementation of the systems is said to be polluted by the exhaust gases, when, especially when intake air temperatures are too low. That could be true. The issue is we think that can be solved, because if low temperature are an issue, the intake air can be heated with the heat that's amply available in the engine. But we have to be a bit careful with that claim, because we did not develop any systems on that. We did not test it. But in principle, guiding the air along the engine to make sure it's warm enough so that the things that manufacturers are now trying to prevent by switching off the EGR are not occurring, we think that is technically possible.
Mrs. Grosstedt.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman. The new emission limits values for Euro 5 and Euro 6, have they had transition periods that are sufficient for their correct application, in your view? And could you also tell me about the situation in Japan and the US?
Well, last question first again, but then without an answer, because I'm not in a position to comment on the US or Japanese legislation, because I don't know enough of the details of that legislation. First question was, did the Euro 5, Euro 6 legislation have enough lead time? I'm looking at my colleague. I think the standards were already set in 2005 something, while being implemented in 2000. Euro 5, and was it? I always need to look it up. 2009, so that's 4 years lead time for Euro 5, and actually 8-9 years lead time for Euro 6. We think that could be considered as sufficient lead time.
Une autre question.
Another question. Now, Parliament is working on the Commission's proposal to improve vehicle type approval. What do you think of that proposal? And in your view, do you think that proposal will actually deal with existing shortcomings?
We were very happy with the RDE requirements that are now being added to the type approval test. But as already said a couple of times, the devil is in the detail. So in the end, the effectiveness, the stringency depends on the combination of the conformity factor and all the procedures related to the test and the evaluation of the test results. And that's a point where I cannot say we do not have any worries. It's something that will require attention. But it's not up to me now to go into specific details while this is a dossier that's being discussed say in this political arena at the moment.
Mr. Dans.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to very briefly return to the temperature question, because there was a sort of exchange between you and Mr. Eickhout earlier, and it seemed to me your response was slightly different. But just to be clear, the justification for having a result that means that you have higher emissions with higher temperature can only mean that there is something going on that switches off the abatement technologies. That was your reply to me. I just want to be clear that that's the case.
Again, slightly confused what you mean with the higher temperatures. So basically there are two things. One is doing an NEDC test with a cold engine, which soaked according to the procedure, so with the whole engine being between 20 and 30 degrees, what is called a cold engine. If you repeat that test, but then with a warm engine, so that has already run in and is at 80 degrees or something, that's where we see higher emissions with the warm engine than with the cold engine. But that's another issue than, for instance, the example that was mentioned of the various manufacturers that switch over or switch down their EGR at ambient temperatures outside of the 20 to 30 degrees window. Those are two basically separate issues. They can be connected, but it depends on, say, what's happening under the hood of the car. That's not what we examine, but it's not necessarily the same thing.
And what you've been saying in response to other questions is that effectively ambient air temperature can be overcome by heating up the air intake. In the US, they have a cutoff of -4 degrees Celsius for engine protection allowance. Obviously, in Europe, we're seeing instances of 5, 10, or even 17 degrees being that cutoff. I mean, who is right here, the US authorities or the car manufacturers? And if so, if it's not the car manufacturers, if -4 is the figure, you're saying that even that could be abated by heating up the air intake from the engine?
Yeah, first thing to comment is that the US legislation is very much targeted towards petrol vehicles because diesels are a bit of a strange phenomenon in the US, of course, and all the limits are basically set at levels that are attainable by petrol vehicles. I don't think we should debate here whether the cutoff should be -4 or 0 or +4 degrees. I think it's essential, but that comes back to a point already raised. Does the legislation require vehicles to comply with the limits under normal driving conditions? I think the discussion that should be had here and that should be had in the working groups that are now defining the RDE and further improvements is that these normal conditions should be wide enough to tackle both driving conditions and ambient conditions that occur frequently throughout the European Union. And then it's obvious that temperatures below 10 degrees are still within normal conditions. Whether temperatures of -5, -10 are still normal or whether that is a problem to be solved, that's a detailed debate.
Mr. Henkel.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In your presentation, you said that between Euro 1 and 5, emissions of diesel passenger cars have remained largely constant. And at the same time, we have seen more and more aggressive targets. And if I understand this statistic correctly, the difference between the real world and the targets is growing. So here's my question, and I'm coming from the business community. I have always learned that if you give to aggressive targets, you very often achieve the opposite. People don't even try. So wouldn't it have been better to focus on achievement, for instance, Euro 5, rather than coming up with Euro 6 and accepting that that gap is widening? What happens if we now say we would like to have Euro 7 and 8? So my question is very simple. Do you think it is better to focus on achievement rather than on setting new targets?
First of all, both targets were set roughly at the same time, so as a natural evolution, taking account of lead times and technical possibilities. At the time of when the Euro 5, Euro 6 standards were set, based on all the assessments made then, they were considered feasible with the available technology, assuming that the technology would be applied at the necessary scale and in the appropriate way. And in principle, we do see the technology being applied, otherwise these vehicles would not meet the limit on the type approval test. It's just that it's applied in such a way that under conditions that deviate from the type approval test, the vehicles perform differently. I have already said, and also in detail in our answers to the more technical questions, that we do think that the current technology that was intended to be applied for Euro 5 and Euro 6 is able to also lead to acceptable real-world emission levels over a wider spectrum of operating conditions. Doesn't mean that vehicles need to meet the exact limit under all conditions, but in principle the emissions can be of the same order. We believe that that has been possible with the technology, but it's simply the way the legislation is defined somehow has created a situation in which it did not work out in that way. And I don't think at this point it's the right debate to discuss the feasibility of the targets. And if that would be the case, you would really need to do an ex post evaluation and gather more information to have a good discussion on that. That's not something to discuss qualitatively here.
But it appears that it is a widespread, let's say, the practice of trying to achieve this target with methods which are not acceptable. I was in Tokyo last week and I learned that 2 Japanese car makers have also fiddled, not with software but with hardware, In one case, a CEO has left his position within 2 days, was a little faster than in VW, by presenting cars which are much lighter than officially allowed. Do you have an issue with these? Do you have experience with that as well?
Sorry, Mr. Henkel, but we exceeded the 3 minutes. Mr. Giesecke.
Vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Smokers. A lot of good questions have already been asked. I've got one about your car study. Is it right that on real emissions, Euro 5 and Euro 6, that there were problems in the data processing and data analysis? And can you say that the data analysis were actually accurate and free of mistakes? And if not, do they need to be taken into account? So internally, what was the accuracy like? I wonder if you could perhaps take us through the process that you used.
Thanks for this question. Also a good question. You complimented the other MP members. Of course, we're always aware of the issue of measurement accuracy. We try to make sure that the methods that we use are as accurate as possible. Given the fact that, especially when you test on the road, not all conditions are always fully controlled, there is always a possibility of error. We do check for that, but also one way of making sure that we do not start to believe in things that are not accurate enough. One of the things that we have done fairly consistently over the last years is to discuss the results of measurements on individual cars with the importers and OEMs of that car. So basically, after a measurement and after evaluation of the test results, we discuss these results with the appropriate manufacturer and their importer in the Netherlands. So there's at least also a check and balance included in the process where the manufacturer has the ability to comment on the results, where, for instance, part of the debate is whether the vehicle that we tested was in an appropriate state. And sometimes you find that the manufacturer takes the vehicle back to the factory, does some maintenance, and then problems are resolved and we do the test again. So there is also in the process, there's some checks and balances. And of course we test all of our equipment. We test our PEMS equipment by putting it on the vehicle while we put it on the roller bench and comparing the PEMS result to the laboratory test result. We validate the appropriate functioning of all the sensors in our systems. So we use all the measures to be as accurate as possible. The main thing is these high emissions of factors of 3, 4, 5, 6 are so much higher that they are way outside any measurement accuracy discussion. Even if the measurement would be 10%, 20% off, you would still measure a very high value. And also there's independent validation, other labs seeing the same thing. And one other experiment that was useful for us was in Sweden. IVL performed roadside measurements where with systems that say from the side of the road measure emissions from a distance, actually also confirmed the high emission levels of the vehicle. So that's a different test method that confirmed these results.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Senalova, please.
Děkuji za slovo. Já bych se chtěla zeptat na...
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Could you tell me exactly how accurate the current NOx measurement process is? We've seen deviations in the laboratory, and between that and real driving conditions, and that of course influences the conformity factor. I wonder if you could tell us how meaningful that is and whether there are any studies that examine that. Has anything been done in test conditions? Thank you.
Thank you. It's not really clear to me whether you're referring to the type approval test in the lab or the RDE test procedure, but I think I think that evaluations of the accuracy are part of the development of the procedure that is currently say being worked on here in Brussels. If you ask us, we could look into this and see if we can provide any documents. I don't know anything by heart, but it's part of the process. We would need to look if these documents are available, but if this is discussed in the working groups, the document should be accessible, I guess.
Okay. Mr. Torvalds.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Smokers. You have some experience of building or creating the RDE tests. From that experience, what would your best guess be? How long time would you need to create or construct a new RDE test?
I'm slightly confused by the question. I mean, the RDE test is currently being developed. It's we're currently at stage 3, I think, of the negotiations.
And I can be more specific. Yeah. When you have built a system for testing those cars, that is a more or less a real driving emission test. How much did that take?
So basically implementing RDE in our own test protocol. Well, we've been in discussions on RDE for quite some time, but it took some time before, say, the first details were established. And as soon as that was the case, we started to adapt our measurement procedures to include the RDE conditions as much as possible. And only recently sufficient details have been established, so that over the last months we have been adapting our measurement program to also include trips that are RDE compatible. And that's a matter of weeks to establish the right route that meets the requirements. So it takes some time. Manufacturers will also have to put some time in that. We see that they are actually doing that. Everybody's designing his own test round in the vicinity of the factory or of the development center. But it's not something that takes years. It's a matter of weeks to find the right trip and to test whether it's compliant and to adjust your procedures.
So if some of our employees would come into your room and say that it would take 2 years, you would probably fire him?
I would have a good talk with him, yes, or with her. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Karens, please.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to what you answered on question number 10 on the PEMS. So the portable emissions measurement systems. You write that the overall reliability of these measures is around 30%, which is very low. Now, if what you stated earlier is that the technologies are there, we can do it, we would need some sort of test to make sure that it's actually being done. I mean, it seems obvious. We ask the manufacturer to do it in the lab, they do it in the lab. We ask them to do it on the road, they'll, I'm certain, do it on the road. But how can we make that measurement? What needs to be improved in the testing procedure? Is it feasible to do it in the time frame that we're talking about, basically to get it up and running as soon as possible?
I think in relation to my previous answer, the feasibility of setting up the testing, that's why we do not have the worries. What I could imagine is where the main worry of the manufacturer is in adapting their vehicle models in time, making sure that they have to update, they have to change the systems in order to make the vehicle perform different from what they have now. And there's some time involved in that, of course, especially if you have a lot of vehicle models. That could be the biggest worry, but getting the testing up and running, well, we don't see a problem there.
Well, but I mean, you say that the overall reliability is 30%. That's very, very low. I mean, the manufacturers, that's their worry. But I'm worried about if we're going to legislate, how are we going to be able to test it? If with such low reliability, how can you count on it?
Well, there are different ways to that. Already in the current legislation, the current testing on the roller bench, that's also a measurement that has inaccuracies. And that means that you have to include provisions for dealing with that. That means that if your first test is not compliant, you repeat the test and you have procedures for how many tests that you carry out before you are certain that the statistics are sufficient to say that a vehicle is above the limit. Of course, if your measurement method is more inaccurate, you need to gain more statistics before the average is conclusive. But in principle, that's the type of provisions that you included in this legislation to deal with that. And that's already the case in the current type approval legislation, type approval test for the roller bench. If there is a vehicle that on the first test is not compliant, there is a procedure in there to describe what the follow-up is in order to really take the decision on the compliance. a similar thing needs to be done here, which requires, of course, some more effort because it's a less accurate test.
So what you're saying is, even with we have 3 minutes, don't we? Even with a lousy test, we just repeat, and that's enough?
I would like to stay away from the terminology of lousy. It's a test with less accuracy than the lab test. That's basically the objective statement.
Repeating is enough. We don't have to improve it.
Yes, thank you. Maybe just one point on to be very clear, because you stated a couple of times that you're not quite clear to what level, whether the targets can be met in real and in normal use. But in your answers, especially on question 1, you say very clearly, so no new technology has to be developed to achieve lower real-life world NOx emissions. Does this also mean with the current techniques, you expect we can reach the current standards that the EU has agreed on, 80 milligrams per kilometre?
That's indeed what we think based on our expert judgment. It's a matter of you have the different technologies. They are now designed into components that apply to the engine, do not do the trick, but if you design them properly, but with the same principles, and that means the proper scaling of the systems. The systems need to be big enough to have enough reduction capacity, and they need to be controlled in a way that makes sure that under all conditions that's the case. That is existing technology, but only different engineering.
Yes, and if I then look at the different techniques, you are more critical on EGR only, right?
Basically, we don't think that Euro 6 can be reached with EGR only. It requires either EGR with LNT or EGR with SCR. And there's also a benefit in the combination of the two, as I explained in the text, indeed.
And that is commonly known?
We think that is the case, yes.
So you would be surprised if new cars that are still coming on the market, European market, are only having EGR technologies?
If we test them, and on our test they are clean under all relevant conditions, then I'll believe that it's sufficient. But for the moment, we don't think it's technically possible.
Okay, so then we have follow-up questions for the car industry when they are only providing cars with EGR technologies.
We'll come to that. That concludes the first part of this hearing. Well, the hearing of today. I would like to very much thank Mr. Smokers and Mr. Keulenaren for their presence, for their expertise. I know you couldn't answer all the questions, but some of them were legal, some of them were very political. But I can say to the colleagues, we'll come to that, no worries. Thank you very much. It's possible that members do have some technical follow-up questions. We'll send them to you. Quite sure that we will get good answers to that. Again, thank you very much for spending your time with us. Heel erg bedankt.
Graag gedaan.
Dat is zeer interessant.
Ja.
Dear colleagues, I would like to proceed immediately to the second part of our hearing today with two distinguished guests from the European Environment Agency, an organisation within the EU very well known to all of us, being active in different committees, Energy, ITRE, and of course now in AVIS. I would like to welcome Mr. Paul McKelvey, is that rightly pronounced? McKelvey, who is head of the Air and Climate Change Programme, and Mr. Martin Adams, head of the group Air Pollution, Transport and Noise. And I don't think further introduction is necessary. I would gladly give you the floor for at maximum 10 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And we'd like to begin by thanking the committee for the invitation to the European Environment Agency to give evidence to this inquiry. Martin and I will split a short presentation between us. We're going to have a few slides that we will share. And in the introductory presentation, we want to be very clear about the mandate of the European Environment Agency. We'll say a few words about our activities on aggregated road transport emissions, both for CO2 and NOx. We will say a few words about the air quality situation in Europe linked to those emissions. And finally, we will address how the agency has communicated our knowledge on real-world emissions over the last decade or so. Can you do that, Martin? So, the mandate of the EEA was defined by the European Parliament and the Council as that of an environmental information and knowledge provider. As we made clear in our written answers to the inquiry questions, the EEA has not been given any role in the testing or in the measurement of vehicle emissions, nor do we have an inspection capacity. Nevertheless, within our mandate, we believe that Parliament and Council has given the agency an important role to provide the community and Member States with objective, reliable and comparable information at European level, enabling them to take the requisite measures to protect the environment, to assess the results of such measures, and to ensure that the public is properly informed about the state of the environment. In the specific area of transport emissions, we have been entrusted with a number of responsibilities. Under the legislation on CO2 emissions from new passenger cars and vans, we compile the annual report on emissions. This is based on laboratory testing for CO2 emissions, which are reported to us by manufacturers and Member States. Under the European Monitoring Mechanism regulation, we compile the annual greenhouse gas emissions inventory, including emissions for the total vehicle fleet. This is based on real-world CO2 emissions calculations. Your questions to us, your written questions to us, focus more on air pollutant emissions than on greenhouse gas emissions. And under the National Emission Ceilings Directive, we compile the annual EU NOx emissions, again including the emissions for the total vehicle fleet. And again, this is based on real-world emissions calculations. We've also included in the slide the subject of COPERT, which was addressed in your questions. To help the Member States in the compilation of their inventories, we have invested, along with other organisations, in the modelling software tool called COPERT, and Martin will say a few more words about this. I will just conclude this slide by highlighting the fact that the agency also reports on air quality monitoring data submitted to us by the Member States, which include data on air quality measurements for NO2. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Martin, who's going to highlight some of the findings of our work on road transport emissions.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to you also from me. As has just been outlined, the agency monitors different types of data addressing CO2 emissions from vehicles. Concerning new passenger vehicles, it is notable that the EU already met its target of 130 grams of carbon dioxide for new vehicles in 2013, so 2 years ahead of schedule. However, as is the case for NOx, we also see that the official measurements of CO2 are lower in the laboratory than they are in the real world. Looking indeed at the past aggregated real-world emissions from the entire vehicle fleet, and not just for new vehicles, we see from the official data reported by Member States that past performance from the sector has not been quite so positive. Emissions have actually increased, as you see from the chart there, since 1990 by 17%. In fact, the transport sector as a whole is the only main economic sector in Europe for which emissions have increased since 1990. and of that, the road transport sector presently makes up 20% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. Turning to real-world emissions of NOx from road transport, it is clear, of course, that since 1990, the Member States and the industry has made some good progress in reducing emissions. The emissions have decreased by almost 60% over the last 2.5 decades. However, it's quite clear as well that this reduction would have been greater, particularly if the successive generations of vehicles, diesel vehicles, had delivered real-world emission reductions in line with the reductions of the Euro limits. And indeed, that is what we've seen for the petrol vehicles. These reductions were matched in real-life emission reductions as well. This map, although it's very small, is from our latest Air Quality in Europe report, and it shows the air quality measurements of nitrogen dioxide, NO2, reported by member states and countries. NO2 is the harmful component of the mixture of pollutants we normally call NOx, of course, and on the map you can see that the red dots indicate the location of the individual monitoring sites, where the annual concentrations of NO2 are above the EU limit value. So it's clear from the red dots scattered across many countries that many do indeed exceed the required EU limit value for air quality. And in 2013, we saw 19 member states exceeding these limits. Now, road transport, of course, is a very important source of NO2, and it's estimated that in areas where we do see exceedance, around 60% of the NO2 air quality is coming from road transport sectors. And why is it important? Well, coming from the Environment Agency, it's really linked to the direct harm that NO2 causes to health. Again, in the Air Quality in Europe report, we estimated that 70,000 premature deaths occurred across the EU in 2012 as a result of exposure to NO2. So together with fine particulate matter, it's one of the most harmful pollutants that we have for human health. Paul mentioned just earlier the copert transporter model, and of course you did submit some written questions on this, so we just took a few minutes or a few moments now to explain a little bit more about copert. Copert, it's a free software tool which allows member states, researchers, scientists to estimate what the real-world emissions are from the road transport sector, and you can do that for NOx as well as for CO2 and other pollutants. At the agency, we've supported the development of copert for more than a decade, together with other organisations such as the JRC of the European Commission. I already mentioned the purpose of copert is to provide real-world emission estimates, and so the data, the emission factors in the model have been based on the best available science across the years.
This is our final slide, and in it we try to summarise the agency's communication efforts addressing real-world emissions over a number of years. One of the committee's written questions to the agency was, when did the EEA learn about the strong divergence between NOx emissions under official laboratory testing and real-world emissions? In preparation for our appearance before this inquiry, we re-examined all of our reports going back over more than a decade to see when we touched upon this topic. And we can confirm that already in the 2004 Transport and Environment Reporting Mechanism report, the term report, we wrote that there was an increasing evidence that standardised test cycles used for the type approval of vehicles do not necessarily represent real-world driving conditions. Again, I'd like to underline the point that was not based on primary research that we had carried out, but was based on knowledge which we were accumulating in the context of our work on air quality and air pollutant emissions. Over subsequent years, we became increasingly certain about this divergence, and we firmed up the messages in a number of reports, including our 5-yearly State of the Environment reports, particularly in 2010 and 2015. In order to take the message to a broader public, we also communicated around this point in some non-technical publications, and last year we decided to produce a guide to explain road transport emissions to a general audience. We started preparing this report before the revelations on defeat devices in September 2015, and we sent copies to you. I think you've probably received a second copy of the report this afternoon. So finally, we'd like to address in our introductory presentation the point made in the written questions from this committee that real-world NOx exceedances should have been noticed and reported on by an EU agency much earlier. We are of the opinion that we have regularly communicated on this point since 2004. But as the agency's work on late lessons from early warnings has highlighted in another context, though, we're well aware that the EEA is not the only voice in any of these debates. In line with the mandate given to the agency as an information provider, we're keen to continually improve, and if we can target our information better, we will do so to allow decision makers to take effective measures to protect the environment. But throughout our reports, we have consistently highlighted the broader health and environment impacts caused by Europe's transport systems, contributing to climate change, air pollution, environmental noise and impacts on biodiversity. Madam Chair, we're fully committed to facilitating the work of your committee, and we will answer your questions to the best of our abilities. We'd also say that as the EEA, we have an important task to support the deliberations of the European Parliament. So any questions that we're not able to answer in person today, we can fully commit to writing to you or even providing briefings if requested of us. So thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I go first to our rapporteurs, Mr. Gerbrandy.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. McAlevey and Mr. Adams. You have been warning decision makers since 2004 about the growing gap between real driving emissions and lab tests, and you have also been warning about the effects on air quality of that, and that Europe will never meet its air quality standards if this gap remains as it is and if it grows as it is. Obviously, you were not involved in the technical question about how cars could achieve, etc., etc. But I know the EEA very well, and you are very much involved in the, let's say, discussions between the European Commission, JRC, but you're also present at council meetings, etc., etc. So can you say a little bit more about the responses that you got since you have been warning about this since 2004? What were the responses from national ministers and by the European Commission?
Thank you. Yeah, we went back and looked at a timeline from our reports in terms of how many times and how many reports we actually highlighted this issue in. And I think we were able to pull together something in the order of about 28 reports that we had highlighted over the course of 12 years or so when we had highlighted the issue of the divergence. We, as I said in my introductory remarks, became more convinced about this divergence as time went on. We relied in part on the research of organisations like TNO and the work that they did around 2010, 2011, which was referred to earlier this afternoon. And we have basically, as I said, firmed up our messages in this area. We very much like to believe in evidence-based policy making, and as I suggested also in our opening remarks, we're also very aware that we're not the only voice in these discussions. I think how I would characterise our experience is that probably from around about the time of 2010, 2011, and I have to confess it was my predecessors, it wasn't me directly in these discussions, that colleagues, particularly in the Environment Directorate General of the European Commission, were very aware of the need to address this issue of the divergence, and we're taking up the discussions. It's also the case, and I don't know if Martin wants to complement this, but in the international discussions in the framework of the UNECE, member states were making it clear there in the air policy community, the air quality policy community, that they were well aware of the difficulties achieving air quality standards without a tightening up of the a closing of the gap in the divergence.
Yes, getting back to what you said about 2010 and 2011, that within DG Envy you got quite some responses to your reports. Did you get aware of any internal debates between, for instance, DG Envy and DG Industry on this issue, where certain interests were being highlighted by certain services within the Commission? And did you discuss this also with your colleagues of the JRC? And how did they respond to that?
I mean, just to, exactly think about these points. I mean, Paul mentioned the date of 2004. Already in 2007, we've been attending technical workshops at the JRC where this issue of real-world divergences from the Euro standards was mentioned. This was very much in the technical community. In 2010, DG Environment had workshops with member states because back then there was a large growing awareness of the difficulty in meeting the NO2 air quality limits. And so again, the issue of real-world emissions came up in these sorts of fora. Typically, our meetings have been with DG Environment. This is our main counterpart together with DG Klima. We don't regularly meet or so often with DG.
And people from DG Envy did not complain informally to you about their colleagues of DG Industry?
Not that I'm aware of.
I don't believe you.
Thank you. Mr. Zalba, please.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Messrs. McAlliffey and Adams. I'd like to know whether you can see any emissions in collaboration with the member states, and if so, well, would you care to comment exactly what is missing in that relationship?
Translation. Yeah, sorry, it was translation. So our connections with the member states come in various ways, certainly at the official committee meetings we've already referred to, also in technical meetings, particularly the communities where responsible for the reporting of official emission estimates in terms of NOx, for example, under the National Emission Ceilings Directive. There are official communities of the emission inventory experts, and these are the meetings where we discuss things such as COPERT, how to estimate emissions, best practice. And another role of the agency is also to provide guidance to the member state experts on how to calculate emissions. We publish a product called the EMEP EEA Guidebook, and for all sectors, that refers to the recommended methodologies that the national experts should be using, and indeed that guidebook is mentioned or referred to as mandatory use under the National Emission Ceilings Directive.
Gracias.
Thank you. And what about the relationship with the Commission? Are there any problems there?
As we said, we have a very close collaboration with the Commission. We, as an organisation, I don't know if the committee is aware of this, but the European Environment Agency has a management board, and it's the governance structure to which we are accountable. And each of the member states has a representative on our management board, and the European Commission has 2 representatives on our management board. It's also the case that there are 2 experts, as you know, nominated by the European Parliament. So the primary channel at a governance level where we collaborate with the European Commission and the member states would be through our management board. On the technical collaboration, it's on the specific issue of real-world emissions, air quality. I would just repeat what we said to Mr. Gerbrandy. We have a long and well-established collaboration with colleagues, particularly in DG Environment, DG Research, the Joint Research Centre, Eurostat and DG Climate Action. We have contacts with a number of other sectoral Directorate Generals of the Commission. We work with DG Move on our annual Transport and Environment Reporting Mechanism. We work increasingly with DG Mare. So we have a number of contacts with the European Commission, and I think our feeling is that those work rather efficiently.
Gracias.
Thank you. Now, coming to the questionnaire, on page 8 of your written replies, you say that fine particulate emissions have been halved since 1990, whereas particle emissions from the use of pneumatic brakes have increased over the same period. Well, what's the reason for that? Are you concerned by that increase? And do you have any measures to propose to tackle that?
Yes, I mean, certainly it is a problem. We've heard from the previous speakers as well. The efficiency of particulate filters has very much improved over the decades. And as a result, the actual exhaust emissions of fine particulate matter have substantially decreased for new vehicles. The remaining fraction of non-exhaust emissions from brake wear, from tyre wear, is increasing according to the data that we've received from the countries. And of course, as exhaust emissions decrease, the share of non-exhaust emissions is also increasing. But in absolute terms, they are increasing as well. The reasons for that are purely linked to transport demand. More kilometres being driven, more vehicles on the roads. We understand from speaking to some technical experts, there is a working group led or coordinated with the involvement of JRC looking at the possibility of defining some technical measures for these sources of emissions. And again, it's something we would very much encourage.
Thank you very much. Mr. Karins, please.
Thank you very much. To me, it's a little bit like a déjà vu of the meeting that we had with the JRC. My question to the two of you is, if you have been realizing a problem since 2004, it's now 2016, that's quite a long time. And very little has actually happened in terms of legislation and action, which leads me to be suspicious that there must be some individuals, some high-ranking political figures, commissioners, heads of state, who have been telling you guys to just get out of the way or we won't take you into consideration. Could you please tell me who these individuals are who are blocking this information from getting out of your very clever institution?
I don't myself have heads of state in my address book, so I'm not aware of any heads of state who've done that. I have to say, and to be absolutely serious, from the European Environment Agency point of view, there is no information that we have held back or felt that we were unable to publish. The information that we've had on the subject, we have been able to publish. And can
I'll introduce. I understand that you're publishing, but what you're saying is that there are no politicians who have been trying to stop you. You feel that actually you've been doing everything and you've not been hampered by politicians. Is this correct?
No politician has tried to stop us in the European Environment Agency from making our information available.
Okay, then, if no politician has been messing with the information, what, in your mind, needs to be changed in the system? Why is it that, and you said it's very puzzling to me that you have efficient collaboration with the DGs, but sort of nothing happens. So why is that? I mean, what needs to be changed? Do you guys need to be made into a super agency with actual executive powers? How deep are you buried in the hierarchy, and what's going on? So if it's not politicians, it must be a lousy system. What needs to be changed?
I mean, at this point, I have to say that we don't simply talk to the European Commission. I have in front of me a document which I dug out, which I wanted to refer to in this hearing, which is a briefing which we presented here in the European Parliament. So it actually dates from the 10th of November 2011, when we came to the Parliament, to the Transport Committee. We come to the Transport Committee in the European Parliament every year to present our transport and environment reporting mechanism. So there we presented the 2011 report, but we were worried that maybe the report was too detailed, it was too long. We know that parliamentarians are busy people, so we actually produced a briefing. We produced a two-page briefing, and there's a paragraph here which I can make this available to the committee. But we were very clear in 2000, and as I say, the 10th of November 2011. With your permission, I'd like to read. Overall, air quality objectives are being exceeded in many areas. There are two different issues of increasing interest that should be highlighted to explain these differences between emission trends and expected air quality values. Firstly, the proportion of NOx emitted directly as NO2 from vehicles has been increasing as a result of increased market penetration of diesel vehicles in some countries. And secondly, there is a clear evidence, so we were no longer talking about initial concerns, but there is clear evidence that actual emissions from vehicles are exceeding type approval emissions for each vehicle type. We brought this to the Transport Committee in the European Parliament. We bring it every year to the European Parliament. If we can be doing better in terms of how we target our messages, we're always willing to learn.
So you brought this to the Transport Committee. Did they basically tell you to go to hell, or did they take it into consideration? Is it being acted on? I mean, so you brought it. Did you state it, hey, you know, the world is falling apart, or did you just, you know, give it to them? Because we don't read more than one paragraph usually at a time.
This is one paragraph. And we actually...
But it's buried in a two-page report. That's long in this House.
Come on, that's not...
Okay. I'm not commenting on the reading patience of MEPs. Different MEPs reacted in different ways, just as in this committee.
Come. Thank you. I think it's good to move to the next. Who's from the Transport Committee anyway? Mrs. Revaud-Dallon-Bonnefoy.
Merci. Comme je voulais poser.
Thank you. I actually wanted to ask pretty much the same question, but let me ask it again anyway. You've said that you've been putting out this information since 2004 and that you gave this information to the Transport Committee in 2011, but that unfortunately it was the Danish Ministry's mailed letter to the Commission that actually got things moving. Now, you have an extremely tight mandate to give information. Now, your answer to question 4 on the American Federal Agency, you can see the difference between you and them. The Federal Agency has more staff and is able to check compliance and make proposals. So I know that that's not your role at the moment, but as my colleague has just said, we have to make recommendations to take things forward. So what would you suggest the EEA should have as terms of reference in the future so that it can go beyond just communicating facts and aim towards a better compliance in respect of emissions and pollutants? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's clear, and this was why I started with a very tight clarification of our mandate from the outset. It's clear that compliance checking at present is not part of our mandate. It's not been discussed in our management board, and ultimately, as you said, if there is a decision to change the mandate of the European Environment Agency, it's a decision for European institutions to change our mandate. If the European institutions were to decide that the European Environment Agency should take up a compliance role in this area, it would be a fundamental change in the nature of our work, a very fundamental change in the nature of our work. And it would put a different emphasis on the nature of what we'd be doing and introducing compliance checking for the first time. I'm not sure whether Council wants the European Environment Agency to take on that responsibility. It's not a discussion which has been contemporary. I'll put it like that. In my own personal opinion, it would be essential that any change in our mandate would come with real political backing and substantial resources, because for us, I think the worst case scenario would be greenwashing. For 20 years or so, we've built up our reputation based on independence, based on reliability, and I believe that lending the agency's name to a weak monitoring system is not something that we would be in favour of.
À propos de la qualité de l'air.
On air quality, at the end of the NH3 and peroxide questions, a little bit, but I wonder if you could tell us more about the impact on health and the climate of these gases. Are anti-pollution technologies able to limit these, or will they be increasing in the next few years? And should we legislate also on those gases? Turning now on air quality again, you talked about the fatal effects of NOx. I beg your pardon, you didn't mention NOx. I wonder if you could tell us about respiratory illness figures related to NOx emissions. If the Euro 4 emissions limits on particle emissions had been complied with, could you tell us how many deaths might have been avoided? Thank you.
Starting with the final question about Euro 4 particulate matter, if that had reached the necessary standards, what the impact would have been on premature deaths. Unfortunately, we don't have that number. Your first question was addressing the pollutants we mentioned, ammonia and N2O. Ammonia, of course, is produced as a byproduct. We know in the SCR technologies it's injected. There is perhaps a small concern that we are seeing elevated rates of ammonia measured in some cities. The problem with ammonia is it also forms particulate matter in the environment, and it forms fine particulate matter harmful for health and the respiratory system. Nitrous oxide is also a similar byproduct from these technologies. So it's very important we focus on properly controlling NO2, properly controlling fine particulate matter, but we should be aware of potential unforeseen circumstances, so it's very important that equipment is properly optimised.
Thank you very much. Mr. Henkel, please. Mr. Henkel?
Yes, we have been told that you had informed the Commission and the public in 28 reports during 12 years, and nothing has happened. I think we have heard a couple of questions. I have come to the conclusion that without the United States and the VW scandal, this subject would not have been discussed as broadly as it is now. Do you share my conclusion?
It's certainly the case that since September last year and the revelation on defeat devices that the number of requests on us to comment on this issue has increased. I would take issue with one remark that you said respectfully, that nothing happened. It was the case that within the European Commission they were developing proposals in recent years to actually address this question of the divergence. The timing is something that I think you addressed when you had the Commission representatives here, but I would simply take issue with the fact that absolutely nothing happened until September last year.
Yes, I accept that. Then there was the statement made, or the question was asked whether any politicians should have done something in your opinion or were informed. And there's another question. Obviously, you have sent the report to the European Parliament, to the Transport Commission of this Parliament. And do you share my view that you have adequately informed this Parliament, and it was this Parliament which itself didn't take actions, those actions which are now being asked to be taken by other politicians?
I would be reluctant to draw the conclusion that the Parliament didn't take sufficient action. From our point of view, we were asked a question when we were aware of this divergence between laboratory and real-world driving conditions, and we believe that we informed the Parliament, we believe that we informed the Member States, and we believe that we informed the European Commission about the state of our knowledge. I should also point out maybe the issue of our 5-yearly State of the Environment reports. This is a legally mandated requirement on us every 5 years to take stock of what's happening in Europe's environment and the outlooks and prospects for Europe's environment. And we have done those. The 3 most recent ones were in 2005, 2010 and 2015. And we came and presented those also to the European Parliament, and they all included reference to the fact that real-world driving emissions and the divergence issue, to call it by shorthand. I'd leave it at that. We believe that we fulfilled our mandate to provide the information.
Last question, very short. When did you hear first about the possibility that manufacturers could manipulate the test themselves by software?
I think it was certainly when we first raised the issue back in 2004, one of the reasons we did it back then was that we were supporting this co-per transport model. There was increasing evidence from the scientific literature that real-world emissions were not matching what was measured in the laboratory. Whether that was achieved by software or not back then, I'm not the right technical expert to question. But certainly in our report, this general guide, we flagged 3 main reasons, and these reasons have been known about for quite a while. One was due to the test cycle. One was due to the permitted flexibilities associated with the test protocol, and of course real-world driving behaviour, drivers accelerating strongly. Are all the 3 main reasons why we saw the difference. Whether it was for software or not, it's part of one of those factors.
Mr. Federley.
Thank you so much for putting the light on a few issues. I will not put you on the stand. I think that you have been answering quite clearly that from your side you have been trying to create political awareness amongst ourselves. But what you could help us to do, not accusing you, but in a world where you would have a say, obviously it's a political decision, but how would we form a system which ensures that findings that you do actually is highlighted on a political level? Because we can't ask you as servants in an agency to put political blame. That, of course, is not the system. But I can do it as an answer to Mr. Henkel's question. Obviously, the reaction from the Parliament side at the time was not sufficient enough, but that's my role as a politician to do. But if you would form another system where we could try to make sure that your findings on this and other areas, because there might be other areas where we're also failing out, can be highlighted and can be assured to be put on a political level. Should there be annual hearings in committees? Should there be, well, briefing papers? Obviously, Mr. Karins proved it in his intervention. They are not read enough. So maybe not maybe not briefings, but some way to find channels to channelize what you actually find in your research, to make sure that your good work is actually highlighted and that it has political consequences if the aims that we set up politically are not followed up correctly.
Thank you for the question. I'm a little bit worried if I'm creating the impression that we have been producing reports across the board for the last 2 decades that nobody has been listening to. And that is certainly not the impression I'm trying to give. I could paint some examples of success stories where we actually have made quite a significant difference. I could, just to choose one, which I think is a very significant one, we believe that our 2010 State and Outlooks report on the European Environment report was one of the key documents in shaping the 7th Environmental Action Programme, with the 10-year programmatic set of environment policies for the European Union. So just to take that as a hugely positive example, and without being too boastful, we believe that our input in to the European Commission, directly to the Council, because we presented that report in Council, we presented it in Parliament in numerous sessions. So we do have examples of success when people are listening to us. So I would just pull back a little bit by having perhaps created the impression that these 28 reports which mentioned real-world emissions were somehow a symptom of the fact that we were not being listened to across the board. A very procedural point, we do have annual hearings. Our Executive Director comes to the Environment Committee, in fact, a couple of times a year, is questioned at length by the Environment Committee. We come to various specific committees in the Parliament. And yeah, we too, I should maybe mention one other point, we too are keen to, as I said in my opening statement, improve the targeting of our messages. We understand that we are not the only voice. We understand that there are a lot of information. So we too want to improve the way that we can bridge the science policy discussion and improve the evidence basis for policy making.
Thank you so much. And my point with my intervention was never to try to undermine the work that you are doing. I think it's really important, and I belong to the fractions here who would actually like to see more of your work in the future. But on the topic we are discussing at the moment, obviously we as politicians, even though I was not here at that time, but we as a political body did not respond in the way we should have. That's why we have this committee. If we would have responded earlier, probably we would have already been dealing with it. And that's also connecting to Mr. Karin's question. We have to find a system. That's also one of the tasks of the committee. Firstly, to find out what went wrong, what was wrong in the institutional works that we're doing then in the scrutinizing of the emissions, but also how do we ensure that this doesn't reoccur in the future. That's why I wanted to have the last part of my question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Federley. Mrs. Konečná.
Děkuji, paní předsedkyně, děkuji také zástupcům.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I would like to thank the two representatives of the agency. I've got a very tangible question. It's about whether you have the data available and whether the calculations are available on how much more NOx emissions have actually reached the environment as a result of all of this. So how much was actually permitted and how much after that was actually produced by way of those emissions? I wonder if you have that data available. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, not in terms of huge amounts of detail, but just as a rough estimate. We've done some rough calculations that indicate had all generations of the Euro diesel vehicles met the legal limits, the emissions of NOx from passenger cars would have decreased substantially, something in the order of perhaps minus 50%. And overall, that would have changed, of course, the contribution that NOx makes to all of Europe's emissions in the EU at least. So at the moment we see road transport is responsible for around 40% of the emissions of NOx in the EU. that would have dropped to around 20% had all previous generations of Euro vehicles met the legal limits. These are very rough calculations, but it perhaps gives you a feeling of the order of magnitude. Part of the reason of this, of course, is that diesel vehicles do emit substantially more NOx than petrol vehicles, of course, so they perhaps have a rather larger share.
Já děkuji. A jsem se chtěla zeptat...
Thank you very much. I've got a supplementary question, just picking up on what colleagues were saying. Everybody wants to know how we've reached this point and how we could improve the situation in the future. There is public funding going into your work. This 5 years ago wasn't the case. Now, I could well imagine that if you had produced and presented these reports forecasting this in sufficiently vehement way that something might have happened. Of course, you handed over to the European Parliament, but I would like to know to whom this was given in the Commission and with whom you spoke, resulting in the situation we're in. It's been said many times that the mandate needs to be changed. So I wonder what your concrete proposals in that regard would be. Obviously, it is important that changes be made, but what can you, in real tangible terms, do to bring that about? For myself and my group, I have to say that I do not think it is acceptable that there was information provided and then nothing happened, because you are financed with public money and there is a duty, if something works as badly as it does, not only to provide information but for action to be taken. This is a private view, and I'd now like to hear very specific proposals as to how the situation could be improved.
Thank you. As I said in response to some of the previous questions, the European Environment Agency doesn't write its own mandate. We have a mandate which was given to us by the European institutions. Our role is primarily as an information and knowledge provider. We believe we do that. Should the European institutions choose in future to change our mandate, that would be the prerogative of the European institutions. You asked in the European Commission, who did we speak to? We spoke to the representatives on our management board. We spoke to our regular contacts, again, particularly in the DG Environment, the GRC. And at political level, we briefed the commissioners, particularly the commissioners for environment. You've seen some of the statements. When we give you I can make available the document that I said we had prepared in terms of the reports that we had produced, the timeline for those reports. It is the case that in some instances the European Commissioner for the Environment picked up those reports and was very clear that he was aware of the issue that we were addressing.
Thank you very much, and it would be helpful if you can provide us with these documents, because the real question will be...
So I have first a question to Mr. Karinch. So if we have a law where we have a maximum speed of 50 in towns, is it then the politician, be it the minister or the member of parliament, who is basically to be accused when their people drive with 70? We are not the enforcers of law. We have a law on Euro 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, and we have two policing. One is DG Enterprise, and the other is 28 national homologation agencies. And the real question is, why did these people not do anything? And I'm angry because when we add up the figures from this agency, 50,000 people a year die, so we have no evidence that since 2004, 50,000 people a year, so we have almost 500,000 people in Europe which have died because the policing of legislation which has been decided by 28 member states and the European Parliament has not been done. So why did DG Enterprise, despite the fact that GRC already in 2007 had evidence, did not act? And why did national homologation not act? That is the real question. Don't divert. So we have two policing agencies which didn't function. And then I go back. You say that you had talks with GRC in 2007. So my information is also that in 2007, GRC had started to develop PAMs and that the first tests were showing that the tests in lab were there and real drive was there. So do you have any explanation why between 2007, where the data were available also of GRC, and end of 2010, when the first meeting was convened with member states, and beginning of 2011, where GRC was finally allowed to publish its results, why did we lose 4 years, which means 200,000 people dying, 4 years where nothing happened? Why? Do you have any explanation for that?
I would have to say that I have to start off by saying that as an agency, we're not in a position to evaluate the performance of the European Commission. But I would say that one of the observations we would make is that when it comes to the monitoring and surveillance of the system, we would tend to agree with the evidence that was brought to this committee by the ICCT when they said that there is a fragmentation of the government system. The monitoring system in the EU is diffuse, as you say yourself. Responsibility is split at European level. It's split with 28 member states. And as we said in our written answers to the questions that the committee put forward, that's the model that Europe has chosen. It's a diffuse model of governance. And as we said in our answers, it's rather different from the system which is in place in the United States, which is a much more centralised model of compliance and checking.
So today, apparently, the manager of Fiat has called for a European body, but one European body of policing, Fiat. Why? Because they are now accused by the German authority and they have the impression that there's political gaming behind it. So, but then back, if your analysis is that US was able to move fast because it was one body, what we have on the table from Commission is basically the same as before, 28 scattered, and then we have one little hope, which is the GRC test lab being the super cop. But what my understanding is, GRC had the data already in 2007, and DG Enterprise didn't allow them to publish. So what is your trust in a system where basically we will again rely on 28 countries, very diffuse, plus one super cop, which de facto will again be under the political control of DG Enterprise? How can that function?
I have to be very brief. The chair says I need to be brief, but it's also the case, as I said, that we have not studied in detail the provisions in the proposal from January on the review of the Framework Directive for type approval. It's not within our competence. It's not within our current mandate. We do believe that looking at it from the distance that we have, that there are improvements there. That the discussion around an enforcement forum is a positive step forward, and some of the improvements that the TNO colleagues had mentioned are steps forward. On the overall question of the diffuse nature of the governance, it's not something that the European Environment Agency can put a recommendation on the table to address.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Avey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here. I would like to ask a question on the common Artemis driving cycle test procedures. And at page 22 of your report explaining road transport emissions, you presented it as a more accurate alternative to the new European driving cycle in the use for type approval. According to data presented at page 25, emissions estimated for different Euro classes through the CADC could result particularly higher than those of current testing. This seems to be true especially for diesel cars, for which Euro 6 emissions might be up to 4.8 times higher than those of the new European driving cycle. Since when the information about the better accurateness of the Artemis driving cycle in estimating the emission in real world has been available? I guess the reply is 2004, but can you please elaborate more, and I ask you maybe another question.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact date actually, but certainly the Artemis project I think kicked off around maybe 2006, 2007. One of the ideas of developing this new laboratory-based driving cycle was that it would better represent real-world emissions. So it was deliberately made to be more demanding than the new European driving cycle, upon which the type approval testing is done, of course. So how it was developed was basically to ensure the engine is put under more demands, the operational conditions compared to the NEDC were expanded. And perhaps without too many surprises to us all in the room, the result is indeed higher emissions when measured under the Artemis cycle.
And regarding this, I mean, do you think there has been any kind of impediment that could have prevented its adoption of this Artemis system instead of the new European driving cycle by the Commission? And did you have any contact and meetings and exchange on this with the Commission?
In terms of whether we had any exchanges, no, we're not involved with the technical discussions around defining driving cycles. The Artemis driving cycle was based as a research-based testing procedure, if I understand, the background of the Artemis project. It's not a worldwide system, unlike the WLTP, the WLTC cycles which are coming. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses, a bit like anything, I would suggest.
May I ask another question? Regarding the scenarios you presented in your report, according to your simulation, the worst scenario, causing only a minor reduction on the number of monitoring stations that will record in NOx exceedances, will occur with Euro 6 diesel vehicles emitting just 30% less than Euro 5 limits. Can we assume that at least until 2020 we cannot expect a reduced number of stations recording NOx exceedances, and that from 2020 on we could expect a benefit close to your worst scenario?
Yeah, I mean, your question touches upon several dimensions, of course. One is that Euro 6 vehicles are still very new. There are not that many in the fleet, and it will take time for any new vehicle generation to come through. Certainly, it's clear that if Euro 6 diesel vehicles did perform consistent with the limit values set for the emission standards, by 2025, by 2030, it would be a huge improvement in terms of the number of monitoring stations at which NO2 exceedances are registered. The fact that we're not there yet, I mean, it inevitably means that it will take longer to get to that position of having very good air quality. Certainly, the RDE testing, as we've heard from numerous speakers at this hearing and previous hearings, it is a step forward, and we very much look forward to seeing the impact on real-world emissions. There'll be a number of important qualifiers as well. Real-world emissions, we need to be represented very well by this new driving cycle, and how that is monitored, we'll be following with some interest, I think.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giesecke. We come to the second round now, Mr. Giesecke.
Okay. Vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende. Vielen Dank, Herr McAlevey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. It was Volkswagen that kicked this whole thing off, but if we now look at the public debate in Europe, there are other manufacturers, Opel, Mitsubishi, Fiat, all of whom it is being said may use illegal defeat devices. So I wonder whether, as the EEA, you've got any idea about which manufacturers are using such devices. That's my first question.
I can be very brief. The answer is no. We do not have information on that.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. I'll try with Mr. Adams then. Second question. In your introduction, you were talking about 400,000 early deaths. Could you be a bit more specific? A lot of figures have been bandied about, but if we were to ask the question as to what influence diesel technology has had, if NOx emissions are that high on the early deaths figure, the actual question I have is, what is the impact of 400,000 deaths, 20% due from traffic pollution? How many of the early deaths would be down to diesel transport, and could we differentiate that further, saying which Euro standards have had which particular impacts?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, I quite agree with you. There are a number of numbers being thrown around. When it comes to premature deaths, the 400,000 number is mainly linked to premature deaths from fine particulate matter. We see around 70,000 premature deaths from NO2, and there is a bit of overlap, of course, because people are exposed to both pollutants. One piece of work we did for the 2015 air quality report that the agency publishes was to look at the benefits that would be obtained if air quality was brought down to the EU limit values. We know at the moment in many cities it's much higher. If we brought it down, what would the benefits be? We saw for that, using a different metric, approximately 200,000 life years would be the benefit compared to a total cost at the moment of 800,000. So how that translates through in premature deaths is potentially around a quarter, 20% of the 17,000 premature deaths would be, there would be a 17,000 benefit if we reached the levels of air quality in Europe consistent with the EU's air quality standards.
Thank you very much. Mr. Palucci, please.
Sì, grazie per...
Thank you for the replies you've given us. The picture you've painted confirms the very sorry state of affairs that everyone was familiar with. You've spoken out against what was going wrong, and nothing was done. Now, there's more detailed information about flexibility that you underscored in your reply to the fourth question. The variations used in the lab tests, what impact do they actually have on emissions?
In terms of flexibilities, we had a figure, I think, in the Guide to Road Transport, which has been provided to this committee, which was based on a study that looked at the different factors. It showed that around 16% in terms of fuel consumption was the increase. So you had the laboratory measurement, and then on the real world, there was an increase of 16% in terms of fuel combustion, which in essence is the same as CO2 emissions. So we also have looked at other studies or seen other studies reported by ICCT, for example, and different NGOs. And one issue of concern for us is that this amount is increasing over time. So back in 2001, real-world fuel combustion was perhaps around 10% higher than it was measured in the laboratory, whereas these days it's normally seen as being in the order of, say, 30 to 40% higher. So there appears to have been an increasing use of these flexibilities by manufacturers over time under the official vehicles testing regime. And that's why we do welcome initiatives that improve the flexibilities.
No, scusami, io mi riferivo...
Scusi, mi riferivo,
Well, I was referring more specifically to the flexibility used in the tests. You can say that you can optimize the test results. What exactly does that mean?
In essence, it just means using the permitted flexibilities to optimize the vehicle according to the test conditions. And we gave some examples, for example, tire pressure, tire depth, perhaps changes to the alternator system. These are examples of permitted flexibilities, which hopefully will be reduced under the future testing regimes. But collectively, they do add up to substantial higher emissions in the real world, and that's what we have seen.
Thank you.
Sì, no, va bene, se ho finito non...
Okay. If I've no more time, it's okay.
Thanks very much, gentlemen, and thanks for your contribution. I'd like to return to, I think, what Mr. Adams has been saying, or Mr. McLeaven, I don't remember exactly, but it's about the unintended consequences of the introduction of new technologies, the emissions of ammonia, of nitrous oxide that are increasing. On the other hand, of course, diesel engines remain more fuel efficient than petrol cars. And then we have also the PM matter related to vehicle brakes and tires. So what is the priority in order to avoid that we keep turning in circles and that while solving one problem, another pops up? In diesel and in petrol cars, when we talk about PM, that's also valid for petrol cars, of course, when we talk about brakes. So where is the priority, and where should we aim at by means of priority in the upcoming months and years?
Maybe I can start with the upcoming years, and Martin can bring it down to the upcoming months. But from our point of view, this is a business that we would, as an organisation, ultimately like to get out of. Because at the minute what we're doing is we're monitoring the efficiency of the internal combustion engine, whereas at the same time the White Paper on Transport has set quite ambitious decarbonisation objectives. The Commission will come forward before the summer with a communication on the decarbonisation of transport. So from our point of view as an environmental organisation, the long-term objective would be decarbonisation of the transport sector. So that's where we feel that the focus should be. In the very short term...
Away from fossil fuels, you mean?
Absolutely. And if I could just point out that the White Paper from the Commission in 2011 in transport set an objective, which is that by 2030 there should be a 50% reduction in the number of conventionally fuelled cars in urban areas, and that by 2050 there should be no conventionally fuelled cars in urban areas. So if you're asking us for priorities in the longer term, those would certainly be the priorities that the EEA would like to track.
I think I've drawn the shorter term straw. Certainly, I mean, we've heard from Dr. Smolkers and previous speakers that in terms of the trade-off between greenhouse gases, CO2 and NOx, there don't appear many excuses. I mean, the technology can be optimized to enable us to reduce both with the existence of the after treatment devices on vehicles. So I think that's a very positive story. Implementation, of course, is the next challenge.
PM is still there.
PM is still there.
Mr. Dance.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your responses so far. I want to talk about emission factors. Member States use them to base their inventories on emission reductions. In fact, you've talked already about emissions reductions that have happened and emissions that have increased elsewhere. But on page 14, it's worth bearing in mind there are some 300 million passenger cars, give or take 100,000 or so, in the EU. And on page 14 of your responses, you've said that the sample size of cars used to measure the emissions factor is 7. 7 cars, not 7,000, 7 cars. On page 12, you deduce, not unreasonably, that current emission factors for Euro 6 vehicles are therefore relatively uncertain. I'd say so. How reliable are these figures at all?
Yeah, one of the challenges is, of course, with new vehicle generations and technologies, until we have the real-world measurements, the transport modelers don't really have much to go on. And if I can look on the bright side of the recent discussions, is that many governments, institutions are making more measurements now of latest Euro generation vehicles. There is a technical meeting, I understand, even this week, where the emission factors that have been measured recently are being discussed, and we do hope later in the year that COPERT, based on those discussions, can be updated to take into account the latest availability of vehicle emissions data. But I would agree with you, for new vehicle generations, it's a limitation that we have.
It's good that they're taking in a number of factors, but it seems clear to me that we need to massively upscale the sample sizes that we're basing these emission factors on. I mean, can we judge any of the reductions as being reliable given that tiny sample size? And doesn't this have ramifications for not just the stated reductions in emissions that member states are putting forward, but also in terms of policies that not just member states, but also cities and regions are implementing when it comes to things like, for example, low emission zones?
The number of 7 concerns just the latest Euro 6. Many more measurements are available for earlier Euro generations. They are the bulk of vehicles on the road, so there's much more robust data there. You mentioned low emission zones. That's a very interesting question. Looking across Europe, the success of low emission zones is rather mixed, is our perspective on things. And indeed, there are many confounding factors, but the underperformance of certain new vehicle types is certainly one of them. If you're restricting traffic to the latest vehicles, and diesel vehicles are emitting the same as older vehicles, it's perhaps no wonder that some of these emission zones struggle to find the positive messages in what they're trying to do.
Dank u.
Thank you. A lot of significant questions have been put regarding the fact that you've been providing figures and information over more than 10 years now, on which virtually no action has been taken. Since 2007, the issues have been discussed in workshops with the Environment DG and the Member States. Now, during briefings with the Commission, for example, did they ever give any signal that they would take an initiative? Or did they acknowledge they would have to take some action?
Our primary collaboration, as we've said in response to several questions, is with the Environment Directorate General, the Joint Research Centre, Eurostat, and yes, our colleagues in DG Environment over several years were rather clear about their ambition to address this issue. They were also clear in our discussions about the responsibilities of Member States, and they were clear about the need to address the divergence because of their understanding that in order to achieve the emission limit values, the Ambient Air Quality Directive values, that the closing of the divergence would be necessary. So.
Dat is een ambitie die blijkbaar niet sterk.
Well, clearly that commitment wasn't strong enough, was it?
As I said in response to an earlier question, there has been activity. I don't think it's fair to say there has been no activity. I had the chance to respond, and if I can make a link back to what Mr. Federley had said, our experience as an organisation which has worked for some years with the precautionary principle, which many of you have a lot of experience with, is that it's not always easy to be the organisation which is standing out front, highlighting issues. And as we've said, I mentioned it in my introductory presentation, one of the reports which my organisation is known for is called Late Lessons from Early Warnings. And we do have a number of case studies, unfortunately, where action was slower than we as an organisation would have advocated.
Als suggestie naar de toekomst.
By way of a suggestion for the future, nutrient eco-labelling. Is that something that would be used in the future?
We would very much like to see some form of smog labelling on vehicles. There is CO2 labelling on vehicles, and we would be very much supportive of the idea of NOx or pollutant, air pollutant labelling on vehicles.
Mr. Zalba? Yeah, Mr. Zalba, yeah.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't hear you give me the floor the first time. A couple of questions. First of all, in recent years, has your agency ever contacted the Commission to tackle the issue of NOx emissions and point out to the Commission that the NOx emissions were way above the legal limits?
I mean, certainly in the air quality area, the colleagues in DG Environment have been aware of this. I mentioned a workshop back in 2010 arranged by DG Environment. The issue was subsequently reported to at the Air Quality Committee meeting of that year. So certainly there has been an awareness. Also in policymakers from the member states, one of the other activities we follow is under the Gothenburg Protocol to the LATAP Convention, and there policymakers have, when they amended the protocol, introduced the flexibility adjustments which have also been put through in the proposal for the National Emission Ceilings Directives. One of the reasons for that was the fact that policymakers were aware of higher NOx emissions, and they will have trouble and challenges meeting future emission reduction commitments on the basis of the technology and how it was performing in the real world.
Gracias.
Thank you. And then have you had MEP get in touch with the agency in the context of the motor vehicle type approval directive of 2007, or the regulation 715 of 2007 on vehicle type approval? Have any of our colleagues been in touch with you to have meetings with the agency to look into that?
I'm not aware of any request from members of Parliament to have meetings with the European Environment Agency specifically on the subject of type approval. Certainly not with me and the colleagues in my department. I'm not aware if that happened in the past. I don't believe so.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Mrs. Sheldon-Moser, please.
Thank you very much. Well, can you give any recommendations for the future when it comes to making sure that our type approval system in the future will be better able to listen to concerns raised from agencies or from NGOs or whatever? Do you have any kind of recommendations?
I mean, one of the interesting discussion points in this committee has been the gap between the science and the political decision-making. And I think it's very clear that there has been a long delay in terms of recognising the problem by the decision makers. So any initiatives that can reduce that delay, we would certainly welcome. And it's ensuring that the rule books being used to monitor these emissions are updated regularly on the basis of best science. So even for the RDE, the new driving cycle, real-world driving cycle, that again is a driving cycle with a certain boundary conditions which have been agreed and are being discussed further just now. We need to monitor that to check that they do deliver real-world improvements.
Do you regret anything from the way you have reacted the last years? Do you think you should have done anything in order to highlight things a little bit more from your perspective?
I hope I was able to communicate in the introductory remarks a degree of humility from the side of the European Environment Agency. I did say in my opening remarks that we had taken the time to go back and look at all of the reports that touched on this issue and highlighted 28 of them. I've made a commitment to send you a document there. And I said, with the intention to be humble, that if we could have been doing something differently, we would like to have known. Yeah, maybe to come back to the comment of one of the members earlier, it's a question of targeting and making our information as targeted and as accessible for decision makers as possible. But even there, when I referred to the briefing that we gave, the two-pager to the Transport Committee on the 10th of November 2011, I'm not sure how much more targeted we really could have been.
Thank you very much. If I just can come in very briefly, I don't often do that, but there's not only a gap between the science and the policymakers, but there's a gap in between. One of the crucial questions remains, if we're not the first scientific academic organization we have, and you've all been very useful in what you said, but how is it possible that not one academic asked the question, if you see the gap, what could be the reason, and went in and to ask for a mandate to your superiors to look into the fact that there might be a possibility of defeat devices, since we know since the late 90s that they actually exist. And that's part of the frustration. The questions keep on coming up. But I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Torvalds, please.
Thank you, Chair. Your question is actually a question which Hans Christian Andersen answered already some centuries ago. One of the questions which have been hovering here during the whole debate is, besides the mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, which we have also heard, is why are things flying under the radar? I think Fredrik, before he left, said that one of the reasons are us. We don't work in the way we should do it. But the other question is probably also your organization, not your internal organization. But when I heard about your management board with 32 members, then my first impression was that the management board with 32 members from 28 different countries isn't actually a functional body. So we should probably also start to think about the structures and how things come out. Now, I don't accept you to say that, yes, our management board is totally screwed up, but I think we should start to look at why things don't come up, even if, as the chairwoman here pointed out, even if it was there written in fairly big letters on the board. That's not a question, but a comment.
May I respond with a comment? The management, just specifically on the management board issue, we are an organisation which is subject to periodic evaluation. And the most recent evaluation that we underwent made it clear that the efficiency and effectiveness of the internal structures were rather solid. That gives me an opportunity to make a broader point, however, which is responding to some of the comments that have been made more generally about our mandate. As an organisation, we will be subject in the coming period to another evaluation, the regular evaluation that we have to undergo, and we will be subject to a better regulation evaluation, we understand. So that means that as an organisation, the EEA will be judged against the better regulation criteria of efficiency, effectiveness, EU value added, coherence, and also relevance of our mandate. The evaluation is something we welcome. We want to do better, but it will also be an opportunity, I would suggest, to address some of the issues that have been raised here in the committee discussions this afternoon.
Sorry, Mrs. Kloon?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. And I'd just like to go back again to the point made, it's probably been raised by previous speakers. In 2011, you referred to the report of the Transport Committee. Now, you said clearly there's clear evidence that emissions are exceeding type approval. And there must have been, you've seen this again and again. You'd seen it previously as well. And I'm just trying to trying to establish there must have been a level of frustration with you, maybe alarm that the high levels of NOx that you were measuring had a serious impact on public health, which I think is a fundamental issue in this whole debate. Just in your discussions with the Commission, did the words, or even with the Parliament as well, did you suspect that the words illegal or testing was inadequate or defeat devices, were those words ever used? Did you raise it? Did you ever raise that type of an issue? I'm sure you must have had your suspicions.
First, on the experience that we have regularly with your colleagues in the Transport Committee, and I don't know if there are any of the members of this inquiry who are also members of the Transport Committee. But
I am myself, actually.
Okay. From our perspective, it's always one of the most animated discussions that we have on an annual basis when we come and present our information, because there are very strong views in the Transport Committee. And our experience is that there are some members of the Transport Committee who view transport growth in almost as a success indicator in itself. And when we come along with our messages about the environmental impacts of transport, we don't often feel that we're the most welcome guest for some of the members of the Transport Committee. You had a very specific question which was on the subject of illegality and defeat devices, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, and well, I shouldn't make that judgment, but I'm sorry to say we had no information, we had no evidence that defeat devices were behind the divergences that we were communicating around.
But you must have had some suspicions. Did you suspect that the testing was inadequate, or you must have had some reasons, because it didn't just come out of the blue. It was a clear, if you like, there was a clear line of increase, and it seemed to be getting worse and worse.
The deficiencies associated with the testing regime have been known about for a while. So yes, indeed, the new European driving cycle, it's been known for quite a long time that it's not stringent enough, not demanding enough on engines, so it doesn't well represent real-world driving emissions.
And are you confident that the Commission has finished? I'm out of time. Oh, yeah. Okay, next time.
Mrs. Griffin. Yeah, thank you very much. Mrs. Griffin.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry I was late, but I've just come from an event which actually linked energy poverty and air quality. And as a substitute member on transport, I can absolutely assure you that we take the environmental impacts of transport incredibly seriously. I'd like to come back to Seb's point about city regions and the development of policy. We have got energy union now here. We're trying to look at this strategically and holistically. So we look at industry, we look at environment through the same prism. It's not an either or. And we look at clean air, transport, emissions, energy, and, as our colleagues have said, healthcare and implications on health. It's absolutely got to be a joined-up approach. Is the EEA best placed to take on a regulatory mandate to hold the Commission to account? Or would you suggest another agency or body take on more of a monitoring role? As we all know, the state of air quality in the EU is killing our citizens. According to your 2015 air quality report, 14,100 premature deaths were attributable to NO2 exposure in the UK alone in 2012. We are failing our citizens and our children. How can you fulfil your mandate to support the Commission in improving air quality standards when the Commission does not act on the findings of the agency? Thank you, Kathleen.
On the initial remarks on the integrated, joined-up, systemic approach to a number of these issues, we can only endorse what you said. It's very much in line with the analysis that we produce in the European Environment Agency, that we need to take a cross-sectoral approach to the environmental challenges we're facing. On the specific question about our mandate, I explained in response to some earlier questions that with the current mandate that we have, which was established by the European Parliament and the Council, it's simply not possible for us to take on that regulatory oversight role. I did mention the fact that we will be undergoing an evaluation. The evaluation of the agency will address the question of our mandate, its relevance, its coherence with other areas. And the point I made in response to earlier questions was that should the European institutions decide that they wish to change our mandate at some point in the future and give us more of an oversight role, that would very much require political backing, resources. And I made a point earlier which I would say again, that it's not something that we as an organisation would want to take on with a perspective of greenwashing, of adding our reputation to a weak monitoring system.
Okay, sorry. Finally, as a last question, Mr. Turmes.
Thank you, and I want to come back to your statements that you had meetings with GRC in 2007. Are you able to, so you have promised us to give us copies of letters, briefings, which you did for DG Environment and for Mr. Potočnik, who was the Commissioner at that time. It would be really of high interest for us if we could have debriefings of your meetings with GRC also in the years 2004 until today, because that will allow us to better understand when was testing done and when were results really there.
I can just say that any information that we have that we can document going back, we will make available. So you have the commitment that if we have documentation, that the documentation we have will be made available to the committee, and we will take that back to Copenhagen and look at the documentation that we have.
Thank you for that. So on the numbers. So UK alone is 14,000. If I say it's 50,000 premature deaths by not sticking to the rules, is that a number per year? Is that a number which is completely outrageous? And where would be the number if it is not 50,000?
Yeah, I'm not quite certain where the 50,000 number is coming from. We've shown across Europe from all sources premature deaths in the EU 28 totaled around 70,000 for the year 2012. Of that, a fraction comes from the road transport sector.
I think then in written, I would be pleased if you could give us, because I think that's relevant. Here we have a scandal, which is for me the biggest scandal fraud which has ever happened in industry policy in Europe. It goes back to 2004. So we need from you, let's say, a rough estimation of per year premature deaths, because I think it's important. My best guess is that there's almost more people now dying out of air pollution of diesel than on the roads. And I think we need, the only way to get enough pressure on this is to get relevant data from you on how many premature deaths if the legislation would be rightly applied.
Yeah, we can certainly offer to send through some estimates either produced by us or by other people.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me conclude, first of all, by thanking Mr. Adams and Mr. McAlevey, if I say it right, for your openness during these sessions. It wasn't easy, and I have to say it gives us some food for thought on the self-reflection also of the role of the European Parliament. We are looking very much towards the Commission, and rightly so, in the responsibility of the last couple of years in these issues, but I think we need some self-reflection as well. We will be writing an extensive report, of course, on our findings, and if you have any suggestions on your mandate, they're always welcome. But thank you again for being here, having the openness for answering all these questions. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, in conclusion, I have to ask you whether you have any other business. That is not the case. Then I inform you that the next meeting of the coordinators will be on the